The snap of metal teeth slicing through flesh silenced Ethan Calloway's scream before it could fully escape his throat. Blood pounded in his ears as his vision narrowed to pinpricks of starlight above the Tennessee forest. This wasn't how a doctor was supposed to die. The rain started falling, gentle at first, washing his blood into the earth while pain radiated up his shattered leg in unrelenting waves. His trembling fingers found the phone in his pocket, dead, the cracked screen reflecting his ashen face like a fractured mirror. Martha's voice echoed in his mind. The worst kind of alone is when you know folks are looking, but in all the wrong places. In the darkness beyond the trap, yellow eyes appeared. First 2, then 6, then a dozen, surrounding him in an ever-tightening circle of chittering shadows. And then, impossibly, a scarred raccoon with one ear stepped forward. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Oak Ridge Valley, nestled between the rolling foothills of the Smoky Mountains like a secret the modern world had nearly forgotten. Its main street consisted of a post office, Wilma's Diner, a small medical clinic, and a handful of storefronts that had been run by the same families for generations. Here, Ethan and Rebecca "Becky" Calloway had made their home 3 years ago, arriving with medical degrees, crushing student debt, and the idealistic notion that they could make a difference. Ethan had grown up in Boston, the son of Irish immigrants who had sacrificed everything for his education. After medical school, he'd enlisted as an Army doctor, serving 2 tours in Iraq. The things he'd seen there, the broken bodies, the children's faces, had left scars deeper than the shrapnel wound on his left shoulder. Most nights he still woke up gasping, the desert heat and explosion flashes following him into consciousness. Only Becky's steady presence beside him could anchor him back to reality. Becky Gonzalez Calloway had her own ghosts. Her parents had crossed the border from Mexico when she was just 2, working back-breaking jobs in California's agricultural heartland so she could become the first in her family to attend college. Her mother had passed without seeing her graduate nursing school, a loss that still ached like a phantom limb. Becky's warm smile and easy way with patience masked a fierce determination and intellect that had drawn Ethan to her from their first meeting in Chicago's overcrowded emergency room. The Rural Healthcare Loan Forgiveness Program had brought them to Oak Ridge Valley, $200,000 of debt erased in exchange for 5 years of service in an underserved community. What had begun as a practical decision had unexpectedly become home, especially after little Grace arrived, bringing with her Becky's dark curls and Ethan's thoughtful blue eyes. Their modest farmhouse sat on 3 acres at the edge of town, bordering national forest land. The elderly residents of Oak Ridge had initially viewed the newcomers with polite suspicion, but that had changed after Ethan made house calls during the worst winter storm in decades, and Becky organized a free clinic for the children of migrant workers who harvested the region's apple orchards. Martha Reynolds, who delivered casseroles and unsolicited advice in equal measure, had declared them good people with city manners but country hearts. Coming from Martha, whose family had lived in the valley since before the Civil War, this was the highest possible endorsement. What Ethan and Becky couldn't tell their new neighbors was how thin the financial margins remained, even with the loan forgiveness. The clinic barely covered its costs, and the house needed constant repairs that depleted their savings. Some nights, after Grace was asleep, they would sit at the kitchen table with spreadsheets and calculator, trying to stretch dollars that refused to multiply. But on clear mornings, when mist rose from the ancient mountains and deer grazed at the edge of their property, those worries seemed distant. They had each other, their daughter, meaningful work, and a beauty surrounding them that no city paycheck could purchase. It began on a Thursday afternoon in late April, when the dogwoods were in full bloom and the forest floor was carpeted with trillium and wild ginger. Ethan had finished his clinic hours early and decided to hike one of the trails behind their property, looking for the medicinal plants Earl Thompson had been teaching him to identify. At 78, Earl moved through the forest with the assurance of someone who had spent a lifetime listening to its rhythms. "These mountains got cures the pharmaceutical companies ain't even dreamed of yet," he told Ethan during one of their walks. Ethan had been photographing a patch of golden seal when he heard it, a high-pitched, distressed chittering coming from beneath a fallen log. Most locals would have walked on by. Wild animals were best left alone, particularly in spring when protective mothers might be nearby, but something in the desperate tone of the sound made Ethan pause. Crouching down, he peered into the hollow space beneath the rotting wood. A pair of bright, frightened eyes stared back at him. It was a baby raccoon, no more than a few weeks old, its tiny body trembling. Blood matted the fur on its right hind leg, and its left ear was torn nearly in half, the flesh raw and angry. "Hey there, little one," Ethan said softly, his doctor's mind already assessing the injuries. The raccoon tried to back away but whimpered in pain. Ethan scanned the surrounding area for signs of a mother or siblings, but saw only disturbed earth and, his stomach tightened, what looked like coyote tracks. He knew the protocol. Wild animals, especially raccoons, could carry rabies and other diseases. The proper action would be to call animal control and let nature take its course. But as he looked at the terrified kit, Ethan couldn't help thinking of the wounded children he'd treated in Iraq, their eyes holding the same mix of fear and desperate hope. "I must be losing my mind," he muttered, shrugging off his light jacket. With careful movements, he reached under the log and wrapped the fabric around the struggling animal. The raccoon made a weak attempt to bite him, but was too injured to put up much of a fight. Cradling the bundle against his chest, Ethan started back toward home, his mind racing through what Becky would say. She'd remind him of professional ethics, of the diseases raccoons could carry, of the fact that they weren't licensed wildlife rehabilitators. All valid points. But as the tiny creature shivered against him, occasionally making soft, pained sounds, Ethan knew he couldn't have left it to die alone. When he pushed open the back door, Becky was at the kitchen table reviewing patient files. Her dark hair was pulled back in a messy bun, and she had the furrow between her eyebrows that appeared whenever she was concentrating. She looked up with a smile that quickly transformed into concern. "Ethan? What's wrong?" "I found something. Someone who needs help," he said, carefully setting his bundle on the table and unfolding the jacket. Becky's eyes widened. "Dios mio, Ethan, you brought a wild raccoon into our house, with Grace upstairs napping?" "It's just a baby, Beck. Something killed its family, and it's hurt badly. I couldn't just leave it there." Becky stood up, arms crossed. "You know the protocol. You call animal control. What if it has rabies?" "Look at it, Becky. Really look." Ethan gently pulled back the jacket to reveal the raccoon kit, now barely moving, its breathing shallow. "It's too young to be away from its mother. The wounds are fresh, and it's in shock." Becky leaned closer, her medical training overriding her initial reaction. "The leg might be broken," she observed, "and that ear—" "I know it's crazy," Ethan said quietly, "but after everything I couldn't save over there, I just need to try, okay? Just this once." Something in his voice made Becky pause. She knew about the nightmares that still plagued him, the faces of the children he couldn't save in Iraq that haunted his sleep. With a sigh, she reached for her phone. "I'll call Dr. Blackwell. She works with the Wildlife Rescue in Knoxville sometimes. At least we can get proper advice." An hour later, with Grace still miraculously napping upstairs, their kitchen had been transformed into an impromptu veterinary clinic. Following Dr. Blackwell's instructions over the phone, they had cleaned the wounds, administered a small dose of antibiotics, and fashioned a splint for the injured leg. The raccoon, which they temporarily dubbed Bandit for the black mask across its eyes, was now resting in a box lined with old towels, sedated by the children's liquid Benadryl Dr. Blackwell had suggested. "Sarah says if it survives the night, we should bring it to the Wildlife Center tomorrow," Becky said, washing her hands at the sink. "They can check for diseases and either rehabilitate it for release or—" She trailed off. "Or euthanize it," Ethan finished, staring at the small creature in the box. "I know it's the sensible option." Becky dried her hands and came to stand beside him, resting her head against his shoulder. "We'll see how it does tonight. But Ethan, we can't keep a wild animal. You know that, right?" Before he could answer, they heard Grace's footsteps on the stairs, followed by her sleepy voice calling for her mama. The conversation about Bandit would have to wait. That night, after Grace was asleep in her bed, Ethan sat beside the box in their mudroom, watching the raccoon's chest rise and fall with labored breaths. Sometime after midnight, Bandit woke with a start, eyes wide with panic. "It's okay," Ethan murmured, offering a small dish of water. "You're safe here." To his surprise, the raccoon didn't try to escape or attack. Instead, it regarded him with an intense, almost human curiosity before cautiously drinking the water. When it finished, it looked up at Ethan again, then slowly settled back into the towels, though its bright eyes remained fixed on him. "You're a smart one, aren't you?" Ethan whispered. That night, for the first time in months, Ethan didn't have nightmares about Iraq. Over the next few days, Bandit's condition improved dramatically. The leg wasn't broken, just badly sprained, and the ear, while permanently damaged, was healing without infection. Dr. Blackwell, who had come by to check on the unexpected patient, confirmed that the raccoon showed no signs of rabies or other diseases. "You got lucky," she told them, "but you still need to remember this is a wild animal. Once it's healed, it needs to go back to the wild." But as days turned into weeks, something unexpected happened. Bandit didn't just recover, he thrived, and in the process he became something more than a temporary rescue. Grace, now allowed to see the raccoon under strict supervision, was enchanted. "Bandit's smart," she declared after watching him figure out how to unscrew a jar to get to the blueberries inside. It wasn't just childish projection, they all saw it. The raccoon observed their household routines with uncanny attention, learned which cabinet held his food, and even seemed to recognize when Ethan needed quiet company after a difficult day at the clinic. "I've never seen anything like it," Becky admitted one evening, watching Bandit manipulate a child's puzzle toy they'd given him. "It's like he understands us." As spring deepened into summer, they built a secure outdoor enclosure for Bandit, allowing him more freedom while keeping him safe from predators until his injuries fully healed. Ethan found himself spending evenings sitting beside the enclosure, sometimes talking about his day, sometimes just sharing comfortable silence with the attentive raccoon. "You remind me of an old sergeant I knew," Ethan told Bandit one night. He didn't say much either, but he heard everything. On the nights when the memories of Iraq surfaced, the explosion that had killed 3 children right in front of him, the soldier who had bled out under his hands, Ethan would slip outside and sit with Bandit. Something about the raccoon's alert presence and non-judgmental companionship eased the tightness in his chest that medication and therapy had never quite touched. Martha Reynolds, who had initially been scandalized by their pet raccoon, softened after seeing Ethan and Bandit together. "Sometimes the good Lord sends healin' in the strangest packages," she observed, passing Ethan a jar of her famous blackberry preserves. "My Jackson, rest his soul, had a 3-legged hound that saved him after Vietnam. Wouldn't talk to any of us about what he saw over there, but he'd talk to that dog for hours. Earl Thompson was less sentimental. "That critter's gonna break your heart," he warned during one of their foraging walks. "Raccoons ain't meant to be pets. Sooner or later, it'll hear the call of the wild." "We know," Ethan assured him. "We're just getting him healthy enough to release." Earl gave him a knowing look. "It's never that simple, Doc. You mark my words." As July turned to August, Bandit's leg had fully healed, and even his damaged ear had scarred over, leaving him with a distinctive appearance that made him instantly recognizable. He had grown from a fragile kit to a robust juvenile raccoon, his playful intelligence a daily source of wonder. But Earl's words proved prophetic. Bandit began to show signs of restlessness. He paced his enclosure at night, staring into the forest beyond their property. His appetite diminished, and the engaging curiosity that had characterized him seemed to dull, replaced by a distant longing. "It's time, isn't it?" Becky said one evening, watching Bandit refuse the treats he once eagerly accepted. Ethan nodded, his throat unexpectedly tight. He needs to be free. The next day was Sunday, their day off. After breakfast, they packed a small picnic and drove to a remote section of the national forest that Earl had recommended, an area rich in food sources and far from hunting grounds. Grace, sensing the gravity of the occasion despite her young age, was unusually quiet in her car seat. At the trailhead, Ethan carefully transferred Bandit to a carrier. The raccoon, perhaps understanding what was happening, made no attempt to escape, but sat calmly, his intelligent eyes taking in his new surroundings. They hiked a mile into the forest, stopping in a clearing beside a small stream. Becky spread the picnic blanket, and they shared a last meal together. Bandit's favorites of berries, nuts, and a bit of hard-boiled egg. When the time came, Ethan opened the carrier door and stepped back. Bandit emerged cautiously, sniffing the air and scanning the trees. He moved a few feet away, then turned back to look at the family. "Go on," Ethan said softly. "This is your home now." Bandit chittered softly, took a few more steps toward the forest, then surprised them all by returning to briefly press against Ethan's leg before scampering toward the stream and disappearing into the underbrush. Grace burst into tears. "Bandit gone!" Ethan knelt and gathered his daughter into his arms. "Yes, honey. Bandit needed to go home to the forest, but he'll always be our friend." As they packed up to leave, Ethan felt a profound sense of loss mixed with satisfaction. They had done the right thing, even if it hurt. Bandit deserved to live the life nature intended for him. What Ethan couldn't have known then was that this goodbye was far from final, and that the one-eared raccoon would one day return the favor in a way none of them could have imagined. The absence of Bandit left a peculiar emptiness in their lives, like the phantom sensation of a missing limb. For weeks, Ethan found himself glancing toward the empty enclosure, half expecting to see the intelligent eyes watching him. Grace would occasionally stand at the edge of the forest calling, "Bandit! Bandit!" until Becky gently explained again that Bandit had to live with his raccoon family now. Life gradually resumed its rhythm. The clinic stayed busy with the usual parade of strep throats, broken bones, and chronic conditions that needed managing. But something had shifted in Ethan. The nightmares of Iraq, which had briefly receded during Bandit's stay, returned with renewed intensity. "Maybe we should get a dog," Becky suggested one morning, finding Ethan at the kitchen table at 3 a.m., hands wrapped around a mug of cold coffee. "Grace would love it." Ethan shook his head. It wouldn't be the same. What he couldn't articulate, even to Becky, was how Bandit had seemed to understand his pain in a way no human or domesticated animal could. There had been a wildness in the raccoon that resonated with the broken parts of himself, parts that had seen humanity at its worst and still carried those images like shrapnel beneath the skin. 2 months after Bandit's release, Ethan was organizing supplies in the clinic's storage room when he overheard a conversation between Martha Reynolds and Earl Thompson in the waiting area. He wouldn't normally eavesdrop, but Earl's mention of traps caught his attention. Finding them all over the North Ridge, Earl was saying, his voice low. Professional-grade traps, not your backyard varmint catchers. Someone's running an operation up there. Hunting season's not for months yet, Martha replied, concern evident in her tone. And aren't those logging roads supposed to be closed to vehicles? Supposed to be. But game warden found tire tracks last week. I'm telling you, Martha, something ain't right in those woods. Ethan stepped out, pretending he'd just arrived. Morning, Mrs. Reynolds. Your arthritis bothering you again? The conversation shifted to Martha's joints, but Ethan's mind stayed on Earl's words. The North Ridge was less than 5 miles from where they'd released Bandit. That evening he mentioned it to Becky as they prepared dinner. Could be poachers, she said, chopping peppers with precise movements. Or someone trapping for fur. It still happens, even though it's regulated. Earl seemed concerned. Said they were professional traps. Becky paused, knife hovering over the cutting board. That's odd. There's not enough wildlife around here to support a commercial operation. She resumed chopping, but her rhythm had changed. I've been hearing rumors at the clinic. Some of the older patients talking about strangers in town, asking questions about hunting grounds. Before Ethan could respond, Grace burst into the kitchen, proudly holding a drawing of what appeared to be a gray blob with a black mask. Bandit, she announced, presenting it to Ethan. In his forest house. The subject of traps was dropped as they admired Grace's artwork, but it lingered in the back of Ethan's mind. The next day brought unexpected news that pushed all other concerns aside. Becky met him at the door when he returned from the clinic, her face a mixture of shock and joy. I'm pregnant, she said, without preamble. Ethan stared at her, processing the words. Pregnant? But the doctors in Chicago said, I know what they said, but I did 3 tests, all positive. She held up the plastic test stick as evidence. They had been told after Grace's difficult birth that the chances of conceiving again were extremely low. Though they'd made peace with having just 1 child, the news hit Ethan like a physical blow, equal parts joy and terror. That's amazing, he managed, pulling Becky into a tight embrace. As he held her, his mind raced through calculations. Another child meant more expenses, potentially complications if Becky had a high-risk pregnancy, possibly her taking time off from the clinic. Becky, always attuned to his thoughts, pulled back to look at him. I know what you're thinking. We'll figure it out. We always do. That night, after sharing the news with an ecstatic Grace, who immediately began campaigning for a sister, Ethan sat on the porch swing, staring at the darkened tree line. The financial tightrope they walked had just become narrower. The rural healthcare loan forgiveness would cover most of their medical school debt if they stayed the full 5 years, but they were only halfway through that commitment. Breaking it would mean the full debt would come crashing back with interest. Penny for your thoughts, Martha's voice startled him. The elderly woman stood at the bottom of the porch steps, a covered dish in her hands. Mrs. Reynolds, I didn't hear you drive up. Been walking since I was 9 months old. Still remember how? She ascended the steps with deliberate care and set the dish on the small table. Chicken and dumplings. Heard your news from Becky at the grocery store. Figured you could use some comfort food while you sit out here looking like you're calculating the weight of the world. Ethan managed to smile. That obvious, huh? Son, I've buried 2 husbands and a child. I know worry when I see it. She lowered herself onto the swing beside him with a soft grunt. Money troubles? Is there any other kind in a place like this? Martha's laugh was a dry cackle. Oh, there's plenty kinds of trouble to go around. Money's just the one folks find easiest to talk about. She patted his knee with a gnarled hand. My Jackson used to say, "The good Lord doesn't give you more than you can handle, but sometimes I wish he didn't trust me so much." Despite himself, Ethan laughed. Sounds like wise words. He had his moments. Martha gazed out at the dark tree line. You know, when I first came to Oak Ridge as a bride, we didn't have running water or electricity. Jackson worked the mines and I took in washing. Every penny counted, but we managed. Things are a bit more complicated these days. Student loans, insurance, licensing fees. Packaging's different, but the problem's the same. Not enough coming in, too much going out. She turned to look at him directly. This place needs you, Dr. Calloway. More than you know. Before you and Becky came, folks around here had to drive an hour to see a doctor who'd treat them without insurance. A lot of people died on that drive. The weight of her words settled on him. It wasn't just about his family's financial security. It was about the community that had come to depend on them. We're not going anywhere, he assured her. Just need to figure out how to make things stretch a bit further. Martha nodded, satisfied. Good. Because that little girl of yours needs to grow up somewhere folks know her name. She pushed herself up from the swing. Now heat those dumplings before you eat them. And don't stay out here all night talking to the raccoons. They got their own problems. As Martha made her slow way down the steps, Ethan called after her, I never said anything about raccoons. The old woman didn't turn around, but he could hear the smile in her voice. Didn't have to. Whole town knows about your rescue operation. Some folks thought you were crazy. I just figured you were remembering what it means to be human. After Martha left, Ethan remained on the porch, her words echoing in his mind. The decision to release Bandit had been the right one, he knew that. But as he stared into the darkness of the surrounding forest, he couldn't help wondering where the one-eared raccoon was now and whether he was safe from the traps Earl had mentioned. The next few weeks brought a flurry of activity. Becky's pregnancy was confirmed by Dr. Patel at the county hospital. Given her history, she was classified as high risk and scheduled for regular monitoring. The clinic became busier with the summer virus making the rounds, and Grace, excited about becoming a big sister, became even more energetic than usual. Ethan had almost forgotten about Earl's concerns regarding traps when the old man himself appeared at the clinic one Friday afternoon, a deep cut on his forearm needing stitches. Caught it on some barbed wire, Earl explained as Ethan cleaned the wound. Been clearing some trails on the North Ridge. Looking for those traps you mentioned? Ethan asked casually, threading a suture needle. Earl's eyes narrowed slightly. Got good hearing for a city boy, don't you? Comes with the medical training. Seriously, though, did you find anything? The older man was silent as Ethan placed the first stitch. Finally, he sighed. Found 3 so far. Nasty things. Steel jaw traps. The kind that'll snap a leg clean through. Illegal in most states now. Ethan's hands remained steady, but his stomach tightened. Any idea who's setting them? Got my suspicions. There's been a new hunting outfitter operating just outside county lines. Rumor has it they're offering specialty experiences for rich folks who want to shoot something exotic. In Tennessee? What's exotic here? Earl's expression was grim. You'd be surprised what people will pay to kill. Black bears out of season, bobcats, even red wolves if they can find them, and they pay extra for trophies like raccoons with unusual markings. The needle paused mid-stitch as Ethan absorbed this. That's sick. That's business. These aren't local boys doing it for food or tradition. This is organized, professional. Earl winced as Ethan resumed stitching. I've been marking the trap locations on a map, reporting them to the game warden, but they keep showing up faster than we can clear them. Isn't there something more that can be done? Federal wildlife authorities or something? Earl snorted. Budget cuts. One warden covering 3 counties. By the time they get enough evidence for an operation, there won't be much wildlife left to protect. He studied Ethan's face. You're thinking about that raccoon of yours, aren't you? Bandit? And he wasn't ours, not really. But, yeah, nature's tough, Doc. And raccoons are smart. Smarter than most folks give 'em credit for. If any critter's gonna survive out there, it's raccoons. Ethan finished the last stitch and began bandaging the wound. You ever have a pet growing up, Earl? Had a blue tick hound named General, best hunting dog in 3 counties. And if someone told you General was in danger, what would you have done? Earl's weathered face softened slightly. Would have moved heaven and earth. He flexed his bandaged arm carefully. But that raccoon ain't General, and you ain't a boy no more. You got responsibilities. I know. Ethan secured the bandage. But that doesn't mean I don't still care what happens to him. Earl stood, reaching for his wallet, but Ethan waved him off. On the house. Just keep me posted about those traps, will you? The older man studied him for a moment, then nodded. Fair enough, but, Doc, stay out of those woods. Whoever's setting these traps, they ain't the kind of folks you want to cross. That night, Ethan dreamed of Bandit caught in a steel trap, his intelligent eyes pleading for help that never came. He woke gasping, the sheets damp with sweat. Beside him, Becky stirred. Bad dream? The usual. Go back to sleep. Instead, she propped herself up on one elbow, her face silvered by moonlight through the window. It wasn't the usual. You didn't call out any names from Iraq. Ethan sighed. It was about Bandit. Ah, she was quiet for a moment. You know, I've been meaning to tell you something. I've been doing some research. About raccoons. Research? What kind of research? Becky sat up fully now, drawing her knees to her chest. There's mounting evidence that raccoons possess a form of intelligence that's been severely underestimated. Their problem-solving abilities, memory, and social structures are incredibly complex. Ethan blinked at this unexpected turn. Okay, but why are you researching this? She hesitated. Because of Bandit. The way he interacted with us, especially with you. It wasn't just normal animal behavior. I've been corresponding with a wildlife biologist at UT Knoxville who studies cognitive abilities in mammals. She's very interested in our observations. You've been talking to scientists about Bandit? Since when? Since we released him. Becky reached for his hand. Ethan, I know how much he helped you. With the nightmares, the anxiety. I thought if we could understand more about how and why, maybe it could help others. Veterans with PTSD, children with trauma. Ethan was silent, processing this revelation. Finally, he said, Earl told me today that there are people setting illegal traps in the forest, hunting exotic trophies, including raccoons with unusual markings. Becky's hand tightened on his, like a raccoon with one ear. Possibly. She was quiet for a long moment. We can't go back and get him, Ethan. Even if we could find him. He's wild. I know. Ethan lay back down, staring at the ceiling. I just wish there was something we could do. Maybe there is. Becky's voice had taken on the determined tone he recognized from her advocacy work at the clinic. If we could document the illegal trapping, gather evidence for the authorities. Earl's already doing that. One man against an operation with resources. Then maybe he needs help. She snuggled against his side. Let's talk to him tomorrow. See what we can do, legally and safely, okay? Ethan nodded, though unease still churned in his stomach. As he drifted back to sleep, his last conscious thought was of Bandit's eyes, intelligent, watchful, and somehow profoundly understanding of the broken places within him. The next morning brought a surprise visit from Earl. He arrived as they were finishing breakfast, his truck kicking up dust as it rolled up their driveway. Doc, he called as Ethan met him on the porch. "Got something to show you. Reckon you'll want to see this." In the bed of Earl's pickup lay a stack of wooden crates. "Found these stashed near one of the trap sites," Earl explained, pulling back a tarp to reveal the crate's contents. Dozens of steel jaw traps, each capable of snapping a leg bone on impact. "My God," Ethan breathed. "There are enough here to cover half the forest." "Yep, and look at this." Earl pointed to a small metal tag on one of the traps. "Same manufacturer that supplies predator control operations out west. These ain't your local hardware store traps. Someone's investing serious money." "Did you report these to the game warden?" Earl nodded. "Called him this morning. He's stretched thin with a poaching case over in Greene County, but he's coming out tomorrow." He fixed Ethan with a steady gaze. "Thought you might want to help me map where I found these. Get a better picture of what we're dealing with." Ethan glanced back at the house where Becky was watching from the doorway. She gave a small nod. "Let me get my boots," Ethan said. The decision to help Earl document the trapping operation marked a turning point. What had begun as concern for one raccoon was evolving into something larger, a commitment to protecting the forest that had become their home, and all the creatures within it. 3 years passed like the seasons, swiftly, inexorably, each bringing its own joys and challenges. Grace was now 7, a whirlwind of energy and curiosity with her mother's dark curls and her father's thoughtful nature. Noah, their unexpected blessing, had just celebrated his 2nd birthday, a sturdy boy with a mischievous smile who toddled after his sister with unwavering determination. The clinic had grown, adding a part-time nurse and expanding its hours to accommodate the increasing number of patients who drove from neighboring counties to see the doctors who would treat them regardless of their insurance status. It wasn't making them rich, far from it, but they were managing, the loan forgiveness program keeping the specters of their student debt at bay. Their investigation with Earl into the illegal trapping operation had yielded mixed results. The game warden had confiscated the traps and increased patrols, but without catching anyone in the act, there was little more that could be done. For a time, the traps had disappeared, but within months, Earl began finding new ones, more carefully hidden. "It's like trying to bail out the ocean with a teacup," he'd told Ethan during one of their now regular Sunday morning hikes. "They got resources we don't." Ethan had continued to accompany Earl on his monitoring trips, when time allowed, partly out of concern for the forest and its wildlife, but also, though he rarely admitted it, in hopes of glimpsing a certain one-eared raccoon. Despite occasional reports from hikers of an unusually bold raccoon that matched Bandit's description, Ethan had never seen him again. Becky's research with Dr. Sarah Blackwell at the University of Tennessee had progressed, resulting in a small grant to study raccoon intelligence and social structures. She spent her rare free time setting up wildlife cameras in the forest and analyzing the footage, occasionally publishing her findings in ecological journals under a pseudonym to avoid attracting attention to their specific location. "You won't believe what the cameras caught last night," she told Ethan one morning, her eyes bright with excitement, as she poured coffee into travel mugs. It was Tuesday, their busiest day at the clinic, and they were already running late. "A group of raccoons working together to solve a puzzle box I left out. They've developed a system. One watches for predators while the others work. They're actually taking turns." Ethan smiled, securing Noah in his car seat while Grace impatiently bounced by the door. "Any sign of our friend?" Becky's enthusiasm dimmed slightly. "No, not this time." She didn't need to specify which friend. It had become their private shorthand for Bandit. The weather that spring had been unusually wet, with persistent rain saturating the ground and raising the water levels in the streams and rivers that threaded through the mountains. The National Weather Service had issued flash flood warnings for several counties, including theirs. "They're saying we might get another 3 inches tonight," Martha Reynolds told Ethan when she came in for her blood pressure check that afternoon. At 81, Martha remained a force of nature herself, still living independently in the farmhouse her grandfather had built, still driving her ancient Buick to church every Sunday. Earl's worried about that logging road on the North Ridge washing out. Says if it goes, it could take half the hillside with it. Ethan made a note to check their emergency supplies when he got home. In rural areas like Oak Ridge Valley, power outages could last for days after severe storms, and the winding mountain roads could become impassable. "You and the little ones are welcome to come stay with me if it gets bad," Martha offered as he took her blood pressure. "I'm on high ground and my generator still runs like a champ." "Thanks, Mrs. Reynolds, but I'm sure we'll be fine. The house has weathered worse." Martha fixed him with a stern look. "Pride goeth before destruction, Dr. Calloway. You mark my words, this storm's gonna be a bad one." Martha's prediction proved accurate. By the time Ethan finished his last appointment and locked up the clinic, the rain was falling in sheets, driven by a strengthening wind that bent the trees along Main Street. The normally 20-minute drive home took nearly 45 minutes, with sections of the road already covered by standing water. When he finally pulled into their driveway, Becky met him at the door, Noah on her hip. "Earl called," she said without preamble. "The logging road on the North Ridge collapsed about an hour ago. Took out some power lines with it. He's up there now with the volunteer fire department trying to secure the area before the main storm hits. Is everyone okay? No reports of injuries yet, but Earl's worried about hikers who might be stranded. And..." She hesitated, glancing at Grace, who was setting the table for dinner, out of earshot. "He said there's evidence that someone was up there recently. Tire tracks, fresh-cut paths through the underbrush." Ethan understood the implication. The trappers might have been working just before the collapse. "Did he call the game warden?" "He's tied up with evacuation orders on the other side of the county. Won't be able to get out there until tomorrow at the earliest." Becky shifted Noah to her other hip. "Earl asked if you could come up and take a look. Said there might be injuries they haven't found yet." Ethan glanced out the window at the worsening storm, then back at his family. The responsible thing would be to stay home, to ensure their safety first. "I'll go after dinner," he said finally, "but only for a quick assessment. If there's anyone hurt, they can't wait until tomorrow." Dinner was a rushed affair, with the power flickering ominously several times before stabilizing. Ethan packed his medical bag with extra supplies, pulled on his rain gear, and kissed Becky and the children goodbye. "Be careful," Becky said, holding his face between her hands. "We need you to come back in one piece." "Always." Ethan managed a reassuring smile. "I'll call when I'm on my way home." The drive to the North Ridge access road was harrowing, with the rain now coming down in blinding torrents. Twice, Ethan had to stop to clear fallen branches from the road. By the time he reached the staging area where several emergency vehicles were parked, night was falling, turning the forest into a dripping, impenetrable wall of darkness beyond the reach of headlights. Earl was coordinating with the volunteer firefighters, his tall frame easy to spot even in the downpour. He looked up as Ethan approached, relief evident on his weathered face. "Glad you made it, Doc. Got a situation here." Earl led him to a makeshift shelter where 3 hikers sat wrapped in emergency blankets, looking shaken but largely unharmed. "Found these folks about a half-mile from the collapse. They're okay, but they reported seeing someone else up there. A man with equipment moving deeper into the forest right before the road gave way." Ethan knelt to examine the hikers, confirming they had only minor scrapes and bruises. "Have search and rescue gone up to look for this other person?" Earl shook his head. "Too dangerous with the ongoing rain. The whole hillside's unstable. We're pulling back until morning unless we get a distress call or specific location." "So why am I here?" Ethan asked, confused. Earl drew him away from the others, lowering his voice. "Because I found something else. He reached into his jacket and withdrew a small plastic evidence bag containing what looked like a remote control device. It's a trigger for the traps. High tech. Sets them off remotely once an animal is detected. Illegal as hell. Ethan stared at the device. Where did you find this? Near where the road collapsed. It was half buried in mud like someone dropped it in a hurry. Earl's expression was grim. Whoever was up there wasn't just setting traps, Doc. They were actively hunting. And based on these tracks I found, they were after something specific. A chill that had nothing to do with the rain ran down Ethan's spine. What kind of tracks? Raccoon. Multiple sets, heading toward the old fire lookout tower. Earl hesitated, and one set was different. Unusual gait, like the animal had an old injury. Ethan's heart seemed to skip a beat. Bandit. Can't say for sure, but it fits. Earl glanced back at the emergency vehicles. I can't go up there officially, too dangerous, but I know these woods better than anyone. If someone's hunting our one-eared friend, I aim to stop them. I'm coming with you, Ethan said without hesitation. Earl studied him for a long moment, then nodded. Figured you'd say that. But Doc, this ain't a hike in the park. That hillside could go at any minute, and whoever's up there with those traps ain't likely to welcome company. I understand. Ethan thought of Becky and the children, waiting for him at home. The sensible thing would be to turn around now, to let the authorities handle this in the morning. But the image of Bandit caught in one of those steel traps, alone in the storm, overrode his better judgment. Let me just call my wife first. The call to Becky was brief and not entirely honest. Ethan told her he needed to stay and help with the hikers, that he'd be home as soon as he could. She'd heard the evasion in his voice, she always did, but didn't press him. Just come home safe, she'd said, the sound of Noah crying in the background. We'll be waiting. 20 minutes later, Ethan and Earl were making their way up a narrow trail that skirted the collapsed logging road. The rain had slackened slightly, but the ground was treacherous, slick with mud and debris. They moved by the light of powerful LED flashlights, their breath forming clouds in the cooling night air. Place used to be beautiful before they started logging back in the 80s, Earl said as they climbed. Old growth forest, some trees older than the nation itself. Now look at it. Even in the dark, Ethan could see what Earl meant. The ridge had been heavily logged, with only scattered stands of mature trees remaining. The rest was a patchwork of younger growth and scrubby underbrush, perfect cover for animals, but a testament to human exploitation. You ever wonder why I care so much about these woods, Doc? Earl asked after they'd been walking for nearly half an hour. Man my age should be in a recliner watching game shows, not traipsing around in the rain. I figured you just loved nature. Earl's laugh was short and without humor. That's part of it. But the truth is, I owe this forest. He paused, leaning on his walking stick. 40 years ago, I was on the other side of things. Worked for one of the logging companies. Made good money cutting down trees that had stood for centuries. Didn't think twice about it. Ethan was surprised. Earl had always seemed the consummate conservationist. What changed? Vietnam changed me first. Came back all twisted up inside, like you. Then one night, drunk and angry at the world, I drove my truck off this very ridge. Should have died. Instead, I woke up caught in a deadfall 30 feet down, leg broken in 3 places, bleeding out. Earl resumed walking, his voice taking on a distant quality. Laid there for 2 days. No cell phones back then, and nobody knew where I was. Started hallucinating from the pain and dehydration, saw all kinds of things, people I'd killed in the war, trees I'd cut down coming back to life. And then, on the second night, I saw something real, a family of black bears. Mama and 2 cubs. They didn't attack you? Mama bear stood over me for what felt like hours, could have finished me with one swipe. Instead, she just watched. Then they moved on. Next morning, Search party found me. Doctors said it was a miracle I survived the blood loss and exposure. Earl stopped at a fork in the trail, considering the path. Left, I think. Anyway, I knew it wasn't no miracle. That bear could have ended me, but she didn't. Felt like the forest was giving me a second chance. Ethan absorbed this revelation in silence. It explained a lot about Earl's dedication, his intimate knowledge of the woods, his careful mapping of the traps. "So now you're trying to protect it," Ethan said finally. "Trying to pay a debt that can't ever be fully paid." Earl adjusted his rain jacket. "Like you with that raccoon." Before Ethan could respond, a sharp crack echoed through the forest, followed by a pitiful, high-pitched scream that raised the hair on the back of his neck. "That's a raccoon in pain," Earl said grimly. "Come on." They moved faster now, following the sound through increasingly difficult terrain. The trail had disappeared, forcing them to navigate by instinct, and the intermittent cries that grew more feeble with each passing minute. "There!" Earl's flashlight beam caught a reflection ahead, the metal of a trap. Beside it, a dark shape thrashed weakly in the mud. Ethan's heart sank as they approached. It was indeed a raccoon, its leg caught in a steel jaw trap. But even in the poor light he could see this wasn't Bandit. This raccoon had both ears intact and was smaller, perhaps a juvenile. "Damn," Earl muttered, kneeling beside the animal. "Same type of trap we found before. Let's get it free." Using a specialized tool Earl carried for this purpose, they carefully released the trap's jaws. The raccoon's leg was badly mangled, but not completely severed. "Can you help it?" Earl asked, holding the frightened animal as gently as possible. Ethan examined the injury with his flashlight. "The bones are crushed. In a domestic animal, we'd probably amputate. In the wild—" He trailed off, the implications clear. Earl's face hardened. "So, we either take it with us, or put it out of its misery." Before Ethan could answer, a rustling sound came from the underbrush nearby. Both men tensed, training their flashlights on the source of the noise. From the darkness emerged a raccoon larger than the injured juvenile, and even in the unsteady light, Ethan immediately recognized the distinctive profile with the missing left ear. "Bandit," he breathed. The one-eared raccoon approached cautiously, ignoring the humans and going straight to the injured younger animal. Bandit made a series of soft, chittering sounds, almost like comfort, then turned to face Ethan directly. The recognition in those intelligent eyes was unmistakable. After 3 years, Bandit remembered him. "I'll be damned," Earl whispered. What happened next left both men stunned. Bandit approached Ethan, reaching out a paw to touch his knee, the exact gesture he used to make when they would sit together on the porch. Then he moved back to the injured raccoon, looking between it and Ethan with an almost human intentionality. "I think he wants us to help," Ethan said, hardly believing his own words. Earl nodded slowly. "Never seen anything like it. It's like he brought us here." Ethan opened his medical bag, retrieving antiseptic, gauze, and a small vial of injectable pain medication. "I can stabilize it, but this animal needs proper veterinary care." As he worked to clean and bandage the mangled leg, Ethan was acutely aware of Bandit watching his every move. The one-eared raccoon maintained a protective posture near the injured juvenile, occasionally making soft vocalizations that seemed to calm it. "This is his family," Ethan realized aloud. "Maybe his offspring." "Seems likely," Earl agreed. "Question is, what do we do now? Can't leave it here, but taking a wild animal—" A new sound interrupted them, the crack of a branch breaking nearby, followed by the beam of a flashlight sweeping through the trees. "Someone's coming," Earl whispered, quickly extinguishing his own light. "Get down." They crouched in the darkness, Ethan still cradling the injured raccoon as the light drew closer. Bandit had disappeared into the underbrush, but Ethan could sense his presence nearby. A figure emerged into the small clearing, a man in expensive rain gear carrying what appeared to be a tranquilizer rifle. He swept his flashlight around, then spoke into a radio. "Nothing at trap site 3. Moving to 4. The voice sent a jolt through Ethan. He knew that voice. It belonged to someone he saw regularly in Oak Ridge Valley, someone he never would have suspected of being involved in illegal trapping. Beside him, Earl had gone rigid with recognition as well. They remained motionless until the figure moved on, the light fading into the rainy darkness. "Was that—" Ethan began. "Yes," Earl confirmed grimly. "And now we've got a much bigger problem on our hands." The identity of the trapper changed everything. This wasn't just about saving one injured raccoon anymore, or even protecting Bandit. They had stumbled into something far more complex and potentially dangerous than either of them had anticipated. As if understanding the gravity of the situation, Bandit reappeared from the shadows, moving closer to Ethan and the injured juvenile. His intelligent eyes seemed to convey a message. "This isn't over. We need to get off this ridge," Earl said, scanning the darkness nervously. "Storm's getting worse, hillside's unstable, and now we know who we're dealing with. Time to retreat and regroup." Ethan nodded, carefully wrapping the injured raccoon in his jacket. "What about Bandit?" As if in answer, the one-eared raccoon chittered softly and began moving down the hillside, occasionally stopping to look back at them. "I think he wants us to follow," Ethan said. Earl hesitated, then shrugged. "At this point, I trust that raccoon more than most people I know. Lead on, Bandit." What followed was one of the strangest experiences of Ethan's life. Guided by a wild raccoon through the dark, rain-soaked forest, carrying its injured offspring, fleeing from a respected member of their community who was engaged in illegal wildlife trafficking. If someone had described this scenario to him 3 years ago, he would have questioned their sanity. Yet here they were, placing their trust in Bandit's uncanny knowledge of the terrain as he led them along game trails invisible to human eyes, avoiding the steepest slopes where mudslides threatened, circumventing areas where more traps might be hidden. "Your raccoon friend is something else," Earl murmured as they carefully picked their way down a particularly treacherous section. "Never seen an animal act like this." "He's always been special," Ethan replied, adjusting his grip on the injured juvenile who had grown quiet, either from the pain medication or shock. "Becky's been researching raccoon intelligence. Says they're far smarter than we give them credit for." "Smart is one thing. This is—" Earl trailed off, unable to find the right words. "This is something I can't explain." After nearly an hour of careful navigation, they reached the base of the ridge where they'd left Earl's truck. Bandit stopped at the edge of the tree line, clearly unwilling to venture into the open area where the emergency vehicles had been parked earlier. Most had departed as the immediate rescue operation wound down, leaving only Earl's truck and Ethan's car. "What now?" Ethan asked, looking down at the injured raccoon in his arms, then at Bandit. "We can't just leave this little one here." Earl considered for a moment. "Dr. Blackwell, that wildlife vet Becky works with. Could she help? Possibly, but she's in Knoxville. That's a 2-hour drive in good weather." "Better than the alternative." Earl glanced meaningfully at the suffering animal. "Unless you got another idea?" Ethan looked at Bandit, who was watching them intently from the shadow of a large oak. The one-eared raccoon had risked coming to them for help, had guided them safely off the mountain. There was only one choice Ethan could make. "I'll take it to Dr. Blackwell," he said. "Tonight." Earl nodded, unsurprised. "Figured you'd say that. I'll come with you, safety in numbers, especially now that we know who we're dealing with." As they prepared to leave, Ethan turned one last time toward Bandit. "I wish we could do more," he said softly. "Be careful out here. There are more traps." Bandit chittered, as if in response, then melted into the darkness of the forest. The drive to Knoxville was tense and silent, both men lost in their own thoughts. The injured raccoon, sedated with a careful dose from Ethan's emergency kit, lay in a makeshift nest of towels in a carrier they'd retrieved from Earl's truck. "He'll call in reinforcements when he realizes his trap is empty," Earl said finally, breaking the silence. "Maybe even report the raccoon as stolen property." "Let him try," Ethan replied grimly. "Last I checked, wildlife trafficking is a federal offense. So is interfering with traps, legal or otherwise." Earl sighed heavily. "We've stepped in it now, Doc. Question is, how deep are we willing to go?" It was a question Ethan had been asking himself since they'd recognized the trapper. The responsible answer would be to turn over their evidence to the proper authorities and let the system work. But systems could be corrupted, evidence could disappear, and while the slow wheels of justice turned, more animals would suffer. "As deep as it takes," Ethan said finally. "But we need to be smart about it. Gather evidence, build a case that can't be ignored or swept under the rug." Earl nodded slowly. "Gonna need help. Your wife's research might be useful. And Dr. Blackwell's connections at the university." Ethan glanced at the carrier where the young raccoon lay fighting for its life. "And this isn't just about Bandit anymore." "Never was," Earl said quietly. "Just took him to make you see it." As the lights of Knoxville appeared in the distance, Ethan found himself thinking of Bandit alone in the stormy forest, navigating a landscape increasingly filled with man-made dangers. The one-eared raccoon had saved this young one by bringing it to humans he somehow remembered and trusted. Now it was up to Ethan to honor that trust. Whatever it took, he would find a way to protect Bandit and his forest home, even if it meant confronting the darkness that lurked beneath the surface of their seemingly idyllic mountain community, even if it put everything he'd built at risk. Some debts, as Earl had said, could never be fully repaid. But Ethan was determined to try. Dr. Sarah Blackwell's face was a study in concentration as she examined the injured raccoon under the bright lights of her clinic. Despite the late hour, nearly midnight, she had answered Ethan's desperate call and met them at her private wildlife rehabilitation facility on the outskirts of Knoxville. "The damage is extensive," she said, gently manipulating the mangled limb. "Complete fracture of the tibia and fibula, severed tendons, significant tissue damage." She looked up at Ethan and Earl, who stood watching anxiously. "In a wild animal, I would normally recommend euthanasia." "But," Ethan prompted, hearing the hesitation in her voice. Sarah sighed, tucking a strand of graying hair behind her ear. "But Becky's research has made me reconsider how we approach raccoon rehabilitation. Their intelligence and adaptability are remarkable." She stroked the sedated animal's head gently. "I can try to save the leg, but he'll never have normal function. Alternatively, I can amputate and fit him with a custom prosthetic. Either way, he'll never survive in the wild." Earl shifted uncomfortably. "So he'd have to stay in captivity like a zoo?" "Not necessarily. With Becky's research sanctuary, he could live semi-wild in a protected environment. It's not perfect, but it's better than the alternative." The research sanctuary had been Sarah and Becky's brainchild, a fenced 10-acre section of university-owned land where injured wildlife could live in a natural setting while being studied and protected. It wasn't officially operational yet, but the necessary permits were in place. "Do what you think is best," Ethan said finally. "Whatever gives him the best quality of life." Sarah nodded and began preparing for surgery. "This will take several hours. You two should get some rest. There's a couch in my office." Instead of resting, Ethan and Earl used Sarah's office to make phone calls. Ethan called Becky, finally telling her the full truth about their night's adventure. She was quiet for a long moment after he finished. "You should have told me where you were really going," she said, her voice tight with controlled emotion. "But I understand why you went." A pause. "The kids are asleep. The storm's bad here, but we're okay. Do what you need to do with the raccoon, then come home safely." Earl's call was to the state wildlife officer he trusted, arranging a meeting for the following morning. "We need to show him that trap and the remote trigger," he told Ethan after hanging up. "It's the only concrete evidence we have." "What about what we saw?" "We both recognized him." Earl shook his head grimly. "Our word against his. And in this county, his word carries a lot more weight than a retired logger and a doctor from up north." Ethan knew Earl was right. The man they'd seen setting traps was no ordinary poacher. He was Judge Robert Whitaker, the county's most powerful judicial figure, a third-generation landowner whose family name adorned buildings throughout the region. More importantly, he was Frank Whitaker's son, which meant he was connected to nearly everyone in Oak Ridge Valley through family ties or long-standing relationships. "So, we need more evidence," Ethan said, pacing the small office. "Photos of the traps in place, documentation of their locations, maybe even catch him in the act. All of which means going back up there, which is exactly what he'll be expecting if he found his trap empty." Earl ran a hand over his weathered face. "We need to be smart about this, Doc. Man like Judge Whitaker doesn't get his hands dirty without good reason. This isn't about hunting trophies. There's something bigger going on." Before Ethan could respond, Sarah appeared in the doorway, still wearing surgical scrubs stained with blood. "He's stable," she announced. "I've amputated the damaged leg. There was no saving it, but he's young and otherwise healthy. With proper care, he should adapt well." She studied their tense postures. "What are you two planning?" Ethan hesitated, then decided that Sarah deserved the full story. He explained everything: Bandit's rescue years ago, the discovery of the traps, and finally, the identity of the man they'd seen on the ridge. Sarah's expression grew increasingly troubled. "Judge Whitaker, are you absolutely certain?" "No doubt," Earl confirmed. "Recognized his voice and build right away. Been knowing Robert Whitaker my whole life." Sarah sank into her desk chair. "This complicates things. The judge sits on the State Wildlife Conservation Board. He's been instrumental in securing funding for several university research projects, including—" She stopped abruptly. "Including what?" Ethan prompted. "Including Becky's raccoon intelligence study," Sarah admitted reluctantly. "He showed particular interest in it after she presented her preliminary findings last month." A cold feeling settled in Ethan's stomach. Becky presented her research to Judge Whitaker? Not directly to him, but he was at the university board meeting. He asked several questions about her methodology, specifically about how she was tracking individual raccoons. Earl and Ethan exchanged alarmed glances. "The tracking collars," Earl said. "That's how he's finding them." The wildlife cameras Becky used included a feature that identified raccoons wearing the small radio collars her research team had placed on several subjects, including, potentially, members of Bandit's family group. If Judge Whitaker had access to that tracking data— "We need to warn Becky," Ethan said, reaching for his phone. "And we need to get back to Oak Ridge Valley as soon as possible." "Not tonight," Sarah said firmly. "The storm has intensified. There are flash flood warnings throughout the region, and several roads between here and there are already closed." She stood up. "Get some rest. In the morning, we'll figure this out together." Despite his exhaustion, sleep eluded Ethan. He lay on the office couch, his mind racing through possibilities, each more disturbing than the last. Why would Judge Whitaker, a man of considerable wealth and influence, personally risk setting illegal traps? What was his interest in Becky's research? And most troubling of all, what would he do when he discovered his trap had been emptied and the injured raccoon taken? When dawn finally broke, it revealed a landscape transformed by the night storm. Trees were down throughout the region, and reports of flooding dominated the local news. Ethan's phone, newly charged, showed multiple missed calls from the clinic, patients needing assistance after storm-related injuries. "I have to get back," he told Earl and Sarah over the hasty breakfast Sarah had prepared. "People will be looking for me at the clinic." "Roads are still dangerous," Sarah cautioned, checking the traffic reports on her tablet. "And you haven't slept." "I've functioned on less during my residency," Ethan replied, downing his third cup of coffee. "What about the young raccoon?" "He's recovering well. I'll keep him here until he's stable enough to transfer to the research sanctuary." Sarah hesitated. "About Judge Whitaker, I've been thinking. There's a development project that's been controversial in the county. A luxury resort planned for the North Ridge area." Earl nodded grimly. "Been in the works for years. Most folks are against it because of the environmental impact, but it keeps moving forward because someone with pull wants it to happen." "Someone like Judge Whitaker?" Ethan suggested. "His family owns most of the land in question," Sarah confirmed. "But there's been a holdup because of protected species in the area, including a recently documented population of rare southern Appalachian raccoons with unusual genetic markers." The pieces clicked into place in Ethan's mind. Becky's research. She's documenting these raccoons as a distinct population worth protecting. "Which would halt the development indefinitely," Sarah finished. "If those raccoons were to mysteriously disappear, however—" "The project could proceed," Earl growled. "Bastards trying to wipe them out to clear the way for his resort." The wildlife officer Earl had contacted arrived as they were finishing breakfast. Ranger Mike Collins was a solid, no-nonsense man in his 50s who listened carefully as they laid out their evidence and suspicions. "These are serious allegations," he said when they finished. "Judge Whitaker is a powerful man in this state. I can't move against him without rock-solid evidence." "We have the trap," Ethan said, gesturing to the cruel device they'd brought with them. "And the remote trigger Earl found." Collins examined both items carefully. "Manufactured in China. No serial numbers or identifying marks. Could have been purchased by anyone." He looked up, his expression sympathetic but firm. "I need more. Photos of him with the traps, witnesses other than you two, documentation of the protected species being targeted. Without that, this goes nowhere." "So you're saying he gets away with it?" Ethan couldn't keep the frustration from his voice. "I'm saying we build a case the right way," Collins corrected him. "Otherwise, he not only walks, but you two could face charges for tampering with hunting equipment and removing wildlife without permits." Earl leaned forward. "Mike, we've known each other 20 years. You know I wouldn't make this up." "That man is systematically wiping out a protected species to clear the way for his resort development." Collins sighed heavily. "I believe you, Earl, but believing isn't enough in court. Give me something I can work with." The drive back to Oak Ridge Valley was slow and tense, with multiple detours around flooded roads and downed trees. Earl had stayed behind with Collins to map out the trap locations they knew about, while Ethan headed home to check on his family and attend to his patients. As he navigated the treacherous mountain roads, Ethan's phone rang. It was Becky. "Where are you?" she asked without preamble, her voice tight with concern. "About 30 minutes out, assuming no more detours. Is everything okay?" "No." The single word sent a chill through him. "Judge Whitaker came by the house this morning, asking about you. Said he heard you were helping with the storm response and wanted to check if we needed anything." "What did you tell him?" "That you were at the clinic. He seemed off, too interested in when you'd be back. And Ethan," her voice dropped to a whisper, "he was looking at our property, at the edge of the forest where we released Bandit. Said something about how the storm might have driven nuisance animals into residential areas." Ethan's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "Stay inside. Keep the doors locked. I'm coming home first, then we'll go to the clinic together. There's more." My research cameras on the North Ridge, they're all offline, every single one. And the tracking collars have stopped transmitting. It's like the entire raccoon population just vanished. The implications were clear. Judge Whitaker was accelerating his plans, possibly because he knew someone was on to him. The question was, how far would he go to protect his investment? "I'll be there as soon as I can," Ethan promised. "Don't go near the forest edge. And Becky, I love you. I love you too. Drive safe." The last few miles seemed to take forever. When Ethan finally turned onto their road, he was alarmed to see an unfamiliar truck parked near their driveway. He slowed, approaching cautiously, then recognized Martha Reynolds sitting on their porch with Becky and the children. Relief flooded through him as he parked and hurried up the steps. Grace ran to meet him, throwing her arms around his legs while Noah toddled behind more cautiously. "Thank God you're back," Becky said, embracing him tightly. "Martha came over after the judge's visit. She didn't think we should be alone." Martha sniffed disapprovingly. "Robert Whitaker has always been too big for his britches." Even as a boy, he had that look in his eye, like the rules didn't apply to him because his daddy had money. "What exactly did he say?" Ethan asked, ushering everyone inside where they couldn't be overheard. "Asked a lot of questions about where you were last night," Becky said, settling Noah on her hip. "Wanted to know if you'd mentioned finding anything unusual on the North Ridge. Said there had been reports of dangerous wildlife displaced by the storm." "He knows," Ethan said grimly. "He knows we found his trap and took the raccoon." "That's not all," Martha interjected. "While he was here talking to Becky, I saw one of his men walking the edge of your property with some kind of electronic device. Scanner of some sort." "Looking for the tracking collars," Becky realized. "He's tracking all the raccoons from my study." Ethan quickly brought them up to speed on everything they'd learned in Knoxville, the connection between the protected raccoon population and the stalled resort development, Judge Whitaker's interest in Becky's research, and the plan to systematically eliminate the raccoons to clear the legal hurdles. "So Bandit and his family are standing in the way of a multi-million-dollar development," Becky summarized, her face pale. "And Judge Whitaker knows we're on to him." "We need more evidence," Ethan said. "Ranger Collins can't move without it." Martha had been listening silently, her weathered face increasingly troubled. Now she spoke up. "There might be another way. Robert has enemies. People he's wronged over the years who've been too afraid to speak up. If enough of them came forward together—" "A united front," Becky nodded slowly. "But who would risk standing up to him?" "He controls the local courts, has connections throughout the state government." "Leave that to me," Martha said with unexpected steel in her voice. "I've lived in this valley for 81 years. People trust me, and some of them owe me favors I've never called in until now." Before they could discuss further, Ethan's phone rang. It was Earl, his voice urgent. "Doc, you need to get up to the North Ridge right away. Collins and I found something. It's bigger than we thought. Much bigger." "What is it?" "Can't say over the phone, but it explains everything. How fast can you get here?" Ethan looked at Becky and the children, torn between his responsibility to his family and the urgent need to uncover the truth about what was happening on the North Ridge. Becky made the decision for him. "Go. Martha and I will take the kids to her place. It's safer there anyway. Higher ground, away from the forest edge." "Are you sure?" "Ethan." Becky took his face in her hands. "Bandit saved your life once by bringing you into ours. Now it's our turn to save him and his family. Go." With a quick goodbye to the children and a desperate embrace with Becky, Ethan was back in his car, heading toward the North Ridge access road where Earl had directed him to meet. The rain had finally stopped, but the aftermath of the storm was evident everywhere. Downed power lines, trees stripped of branches, debris scattered across the landscape. As he drove, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that he was heading into something far more dangerous than a confrontation over wildlife protection. Judge Whitaker had wealth, power, and apparently few moral constraints on how he used them. If he would systematically destroy a protected species for financial gain, what else might he be capable of? The answer, waiting for him on the North Ridge, would prove more shocking than anything Ethan could have imagined. The North Ridge access road had been partially cleared of fallen trees, allowing Ethan to drive farther than he expected before having to continue on foot. The aftermath of the storm had transformed the familiar landscape into something alien and treacherous, a labyrinth of mud, splintered trees, and newly formed gullies carved by floodwaters. He found Earl's truck parked at a makeshift barricade where a massive oak had fallen across the road. Beyond it, he could see Earl and Ranger Collins in serious conversation beside a mud-splattered ATV. They looked up as he approached, their expressions grim. "Glad you made it," Earl said, clapping Ethan on the shoulder. "How's the family?" "Safe with Martha Reynolds for now." Ethan glanced between the two men. "What's so urgent you couldn't tell me over the phone?" Collins motioned for Ethan to follow. "Better to show you. It's about a quarter-mile up where the old fire road branches off toward the lookout tower." They set off in single file, Collins leading the way with Earl bringing up the rear. The silence between them was heavy with unspoken tension. Something had changed since this morning's meeting. Something that had made even the cautious ranger willing to pursue this investigation more aggressively. "Judge Whitaker came to my house while I was gone," Ethan said as they trudged through ankle-deep mud. "Asked Becky questions about my whereabouts last night. Had one of his men scanning our property line with some kind of electronic device." Collins nodded without turning around. "Not surprising. He knows someone interfered with his operation. He's trying to identify the threat." The ranger's voice was flat, professional, betraying none of the moral outrage Ethan felt. "Did your wife tell him anything?" "No, but he knows about her research about the raccoons being tracked. He's on the university board that funded her study." "The pieces are falling into place," Earl said from behind. "You'll understand when you see what we found." They continued in silence for another 10 minutes, climbing steadily along a ridge that offered glimpses of the valley below through gaps in the trees. Oak Ridge Valley looked deceptively peaceful from this height, the small cluster of buildings that formed the town center surrounded by scattered farms and homesteads with the ribbon of the main road connecting it all. Somewhere down there, Becky and the children were sheltering with Martha, waiting for his return. "Almost there," Collins announced, pointing to a stand of pines ahead that had somehow survived the storm intact. "Just beyond those trees." As they approached, Ethan began to detect an odd odor on the breeze, musty, chemical, and underneath it something less definable but unmistakably wrong. His medical training had acquainted him with the smell of death, and this carried notes of that same sickly sweet decay. The trees gave way to reveal a clearing that hadn't been there before the storm. What had once been dense forest was now an open wound in the landscape, a muddy slope where a landslide had stripped away vegetation and topsoil, exposing the underlying rock and, more disturbingly, what appeared to be a concrete structure partially embedded in the hillside. "What the hell is that?" Ethan asked, staring at the incongruous sight. "That," Collins replied grimly, "is what Judge Whitaker has been trying to keep hidden." The landslide had sheared away part of the hillside, revealing what looked like a bunker or storage facility built into the ridge itself. The exposed section showed a metal door hanging askew from broken hinges, and beyond it, darkness. "Some kind of old military installation?" Ethan guessed, trying to make sense of the structure's presence in what should have been protected forest land. Earl shook his head. "Nothing military about it. This is private construction, relatively recent from the look of the concrete work, maybe 10, 15 years old." "And illegal as hell," Collins added. "This is federal land, part of the national forest. No private construction is permitted, especially not something of this scale." They approached the damaged entrance cautiously. The smell grew stronger, making Ethan's eyes water. Collins produced a powerful flashlight and shone it through the doorway, revealing a short corridor leading to what appeared to be a larger chamber. "We've already been inside," the ranger said, his voice tight. "You need to see this, but prepare yourself. It's not pretty." Ethan followed the two men into the bunker, the beam of Collins' flashlight illuminating a space about the size of a small warehouse. Metal shelving lined the walls, stacked with plastic containers, drums of chemicals, and equipment Ethan didn't immediately recognize. In the center of the room stood stainless steel tables and what looked disturbingly like medical examination equipment. "What is this place?" Ethan asked, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. Collins directed his flashlight to the far corner. "That's what we brought you to see." Ethan moved closer, squinting in the dim light. As his eyes adjusted, the shape on the floor resolved into something recognizable: the carcass of a raccoon, partially dissected, its internal organs removed and placed in labeled containers nearby. Next to it lay another and another and another, at least a dozen in total in various states of preservation. "Jesus," Ethan breathed, his stomach churning. "They're experimenting on them?" "Not just experimenting," Earl said quietly. "Harvesting." Collins nodded, his face a mask of professional detachment that didn't quite hide his disgust. "These particular raccoons, the ones in Becky's study, they have a genetic anomaly that makes them unique. Preliminary testing suggests they possess natural immunity to certain viral infections. Their liver enzymes can neutralize toxins that would kill most mammals." The implication hit Ethan like a physical blow. "They're using them for pharmaceutical research." "Bingo," Earl confirmed grimly. "Cutting corners on drug development. No FDA oversight, no clinical trials, no ethical reviews. Just backwoods vivisection to extract compounds they can patent and sell to the highest bidder." Ethan felt lightheaded as the full scope of what they'd discovered began to sink in. This wasn't just about clearing land for a resort development, though that was likely part of the plan. This was about exploiting a unique genetic resource for pharmaceutical patents potentially worth billions. "How deep does this go?" he asked, dreading the answer. "Who else is involved?" Collins swept his flashlight across a section of the wall where file cabinets stood. "Based on the documentation we've found, this operation is funded by a shell corporation that traces back to Whitaker family trusts. But there are references to partners, investors, pharmaceutical companies waiting for results." "The resort development was just a cover," Earl added. "A way to explain the construction activity, the increased security, the restricted access to this part of the ridge. And when Becky's research threatened to bring attention to these raccoons, to designate them as a protected population, Whitaker accelerated his plans to eliminate them," Ethan finished. "To destroy the evidence before anyone else realized what made them valuable." A metallic taste filled Ethan's mouth as another realization struck him. "Bandit, our one-eared raccoon. He was one of the first they tried to capture, wasn't he? That's why his ear was torn when I found him as a kit. He escaped from one of their traps." Earl nodded slowly. "Could be. And now he's recognized as the alpha of his group in Becky's research, the primary carrier of whatever genetic material they're after." "The high-value target," Collins confirmed. "According to these records, they've been trying to recapture that specific raccoon for years." Ethan leaned against one of the steel tables, suddenly unsteady. The weight of what they'd uncovered pressed down on him like a physical force. This was no longer about saving one raccoon or even protecting a species. This was criminal activity on a massive scale. Animal cruelty, unauthorized medical research, environmental violations, fraud. And at the center of it all, Judge Robert Whitaker, the most powerful man in the county. "We need to document everything," Collins said, already photographing the room with his department-issued camera. "Then seal this place off and call in the federal authorities. This is way beyond my jurisdiction." Ethan nodded mechanically, his mind racing. "How long will that take?" To get federal agents here to build a case? Collins hesitated. Days at minimum, weeks more likely. These things move slowly, especially when someone like Judge Whitaker is involved. He has connections at the state level, possibly higher. Meanwhile, he knows someone is onto him, Earl pointed out. He'll accelerate his plans, destroy whatever evidence he can, eliminate the remaining Raccoons, including Bandit. The thought of Bandit being captured and ending up on one of these cold steel tables sent a surge of protective rage through Ethan. After all they'd been through, Bandit's rescue, rehabilitation, release, and then his inexplicable return to help save Ethan, the idea of the intelligent creature meeting such a fate was unbearable. There has to be something we can do now, Ethan insisted. Today. Collins looked uncomfortable. Officially, I can secure this site, report what we've found, and request assistance. That's the extent of my authority. Anything more could compromise the case. And unofficially? Earl pressed. The ranger was silent for a long moment. Unofficially. I didn't see you two here. I discovered this facility during routine storm damage assessment. Whatever you do with the information you've learned is your business. He handed Earl a small digital camera. This is my personal camera, not department issued. No GPS tracking, no automatic uploads. If you happen to document evidence elsewhere that supported this investigation, and that evidence found its way to me through anonymous channels, well, that would be fortuitous. Earl took the camera, understanding the unspoken agreement. We were never here. I need to return to my vehicle and call this in, Collins said, already moving toward the exit. I'd suggest you two be well away from this area when additional personnel arrive. For your own safety, of course. After the ranger departed, Ethan and Earl stood in silence amidst the grim evidence of Judge Whitaker's operation. The implications kept expanding in Ethan's mind, each realization more disturbing than the last. If Whitaker would go to these lengths for profit, what would he do to protect himself when threatened with exposure? Becky and the kids, Ethan said suddenly, cold fear replacing his anger. If he suspects we know about this place, Earl nodded grimly. They'd be leverage. Or worse. I need to get them out of Oak Ridge. Today. Ethan was already moving toward the exit, purpose overriding the exhaustion and shock. Somewhere Whitaker can't reach them. My sister's place in Virginia, Earl suggested, following close behind. He'd never think to look there. I can call her now. As they emerged from the bunker into the gray afternoon light, Ethan felt as though he was seeing the familiar landscape through new eyes. The beauty of the forest, the tranquility of the ridge, it all seemed like a thin veneer now, concealing the corruption beneath. I've spent 3 years building a life here, he said quietly, as they began picking their way back down the muddy trail. The clinic, our home, Grace's school, Noah's future, everything we've worked for. And now you're thinking it might all be gone, Earl finished for him, because you stopped to help a raccoon kit with a torn ear. I don't regret it, Ethan said firmly. Not for a second. But I need to make sure my family is safe before we do anything else. They had nearly reached the vehicles when Earl suddenly froze, raising a hand in warning. Listen. Ethan stopped, straining to hear over the dripping of water from saturated trees and the distant rumble of unstable earth still settling after the storm. Then he caught it, the faint but unmistakable sound of an engine approaching from below. Someone's coming up the access road, Earl whispered, pulling Ethan off the trail and into the cover of the underbrush. Could be Collins with backup, or Whitaker checking his facility after the landslide, Ethan finished. They crouched in silence as the sound grew louder, until a mud-splattered black SUV with tinted windows came into view, navigating carefully around the fallen trees and debris. It stopped at the barricade where they had left their vehicles. 2 men emerged, one from the driver's side, another from the passenger seat. Even from this distance, Ethan recognized the tall, distinguished figure of Judge Robert Whitaker. The other man, stockier and moving with military precision, was unfamiliar. "That's Whitaker's head of security," Earl breathed. "Ex-military contractor. Bad news." The two men examined Earl's truck and Ethan's car with obvious concern, then began looking around the area, clearly searching for their owners. After a brief consultation, the security man returned to the SUV and emerged with what appeared to be rifles. "They're not taking chances," Earl murmured. "They know someone's discovered their operation." Ethan felt his heartbeat accelerate as the armed men began moving cautiously in the direction of the trail leading to the bunker. "They'll find Collins. Mike can handle himself," Earl replied, though he didn't sound entirely convinced. "But we need to warn him, and we need to get to our vehicles before they cut off our escape route." Ethan quickly pulled out his phone, intending to call Collins, but there was no signal. A common problem in the hollows and ridges of the mountains, especially after storms disrupted the already limited cell coverage. "We'll have to go around them," Earl decided, studying the terrain. "There's an old game trail that loops down to the east, comes out about a quarter-mile below where they've parked. It's rough going, but it'll keep us out of sight." As they prepared to move, a distant crack echoed through the forest. A gunshot. Both men froze, exchanging alarmed glances. "That came from the direction of the bunker," Ethan whispered. "Could be a warning shot," Earl suggested, though his expression was grim. "Or Collins could have confronted them." Either way, the situation had escalated from discovery to potential armed conflict. Every minute they remained on the ridge increased the danger, not just to themselves, but to Collins and ultimately to Ethan's family if he couldn't reach them to warn them. "We need to move," Ethan urged. "Now!" Earl nodded, leading the way through dense underbrush toward the game trail he'd mentioned. The going was treacherous, the ground saturated and unstable, fallen trees creating obstacles, thorny vines catching at their clothing. Ethan's leg throbbed where he'd twisted his ankle on a hidden root, but he pushed through the pain, driven by the urgent need to reach his family. His mind kept flashing back to the sterile horror of the bunker, the dissected raccoons, the clinical precision of the facility, the calculated cruelty of it all. And somewhere in the forest, Bandit was still out there, still the primary target of Whitaker's operation. "I never should have left Becky and the kids," Ethan said as they paused to catch their breath in the shelter of a massive fallen oak. "I should have taken them out of Oak Ridge immediately." "You couldn't have known how deep this went," Earl reassured him. "None of us did. That doesn't matter now. All that matters is getting them somewhere safe." Ethan checked his phone again, still no signal. "Then we can figure out how to stop Whitaker." They continued their arduous descent, the afternoon light already beginning to fade as clouds thickened overhead, threatening more rain. Ethan's exhaustion was becoming dangerous, his reactions slowed by lack of sleep and the physical demands of navigating the treacherous terrain. Twice he nearly fell, saved only by Earl's quick reflexes. "We're almost to the road," Earl encouraged him after one such near miss. "Just a little further." That was when Ethan's foot slipped on a mud-slicked rock, sending him tumbling down a steep embankment. He rolled uncontrollably, catching glimpses of sky and earth in a dizzying kaleidoscope until he slammed into the trunk of a fallen tree with enough force to drive the breath from his lungs. Pain exploded in his left leg, a white-hot agony that told him something was very wrong. He tried to move, to call out to Earl, but could only manage a strangled gasp as darkness edged his vision. Through the haze of pain, Ethan became aware of Earl sliding down the embankment toward him, calling his name. But there was something else, too. A rustling in the underbrush nearby, a soft chittering sound that seemed oddly familiar. "Doc, can you hear me?" Earl's weathered face appeared above him, lined with concern. "Don't move." That leg looks bad. I think it's broken, Ethan managed through gritted teeth. Tibia, maybe fibula too. Earl cursed softly, surveying the injury where Ethan's leg bent at an unnatural angle just below the knee. We need to splint this before we try to move you. No time, Ethan gasped, fighting to stay conscious through waves of pain. Whitaker could find us any minute. You need to go. Get help. I'm not leaving you here, Earl said firmly, already removing his belt to use as a makeshift tourniquet if needed. We'll figure this out together. The rustling in the underbrush grew louder, and both men tensed, fearing Whitaker and his security man had found them. Instead, a familiar shape emerged from the shadows, a raccoon with distinctive markings and a missing left ear. Bandit, Ethan breathed, momentarily forgetting his pain. How? The raccoon approached cautiously, its intelligent eyes fixed on Ethan's injured leg. Behind it, more shapes appeared, other raccoons of various sizes moving with the same wary precision. His family group, Earl whispered in amazement. They're all here. Bandit came closer, seeming to assess Ethan's condition. The raccoon made a series of soft vocalizations, then turned to look back into the forest, as if expecting someone or something to appear. What's he doing? Ethan asked, the surreal nature of the encounter momentarily distracting him from his pain. Earl shook his head, equally baffled. I don't know. It's almost like he's waiting for something. As if in answer, a distant sound reached them. Voices calling from the direction of the access road. Male voices, unfamiliar and threatening. That'll be Whitaker's men, Earl said grimly. They're searching the area. Ethan tried again to rise, but the pain in his leg was overwhelming. Black spots danced before his eyes as nausea swept through him. Earl, you have to go. Get to Becky and the kids. Warn them. And leave you for Whitaker to find. Not a chance. Earl's expression was resolute as he continued improvising a splint using branches and strips torn from his shirt. We're in this together. The voices grew closer. Ethan could now make out snippets of conversation, orders being given, areas being assigned for search. It wouldn't be long before they were discovered. In his increasingly hazy consciousness, Ethan found himself thinking of Iraq, of lying wounded in the desert after an IED explosion, waiting for either rescue or death. The same helplessness washed over him now, the same resignation that events had moved beyond his control. But there was one crucial difference. In Iraq, he had been alone with his fear. Here, as consciousness began to slip away, the last thing Ethan saw was Bandit standing guard beside him, the one-eared raccoon's posture alert and protective, as if daring anyone to harm the human who had once saved his life. Through the encroaching darkness, a strange peace settled over Ethan. Whatever happened next was out of his hands. He had done what he could, discovered the truth, protected those he could protect. Now, in a twist of fate that seemed both ironic and fitting, his life was in the hands of a wild creature who somehow remembered an act of kindness from years before. As Ethan finally surrendered to unconsciousness, his last coherent thought was of Becky and the children, hoping against hope that they would remain safe until Earl could reach them, and that somehow they would understand why he had risked everything for a raccoon with one ear. The border between consciousness and oblivion was porous, allowing fragments of reality to penetrate the darkness. Ethan drifted through this liminal space, aware of pain but disconnected from it, registering sounds and sensations without fully comprehending them. Voices reached him first, unfamiliar, then Earl's distinctive drawl, tense with controlled anger. The jostle of movement sent spikes of agony through his leg, pulling him briefly toward full awareness before the merciful darkness reclaimed him. When Ethan finally clawed his way back to consciousness, he found himself lying on a concrete floor in dim, artificial light. The pain in his leg had settled into a persistent throb, suggesting someone had set the brake and immobilized it. His medical training automatically cataloged his condition: moderate dehydration, possible concussion, compound fracture of the tibia, but no signs of shock or catastrophic blood loss. "Welcome back, Doctor." Calloway. The voice was cultured, familiar. Judge Robert Whitaker. Ethan turned his head with effort, finding the distinguished figure sitting on a metal folding chair a few feet away. Behind him stood the security man Ethan had glimpsed earlier, his expression impassive, a holstered pistol visible at his hip. "Where am I?" Ethan's voice emerged as a rasp, his throat parched. "Where you shouldn't be," Whitaker replied, his tone conversational, almost regretful. "But then you've developed quite a habit of being places you shouldn't, haven't you? First with that raccoon of yours, then with Earl and the wildlife officer on my property." With a jolt of clarity, Ethan recognized his surroundings. They were in the bunker he and Earl had discovered earlier. The same sterile tables, the same racks of equipment, but the raccoon carcasses had been removed, leaving only faint brownish stains on the floor as evidence of their existence. "Where's Earl?" Ethan managed, struggling to sit up. "Oh, Mr. Thompson is being held in another section of the facility," Whitaker said. "Relatively unharmed, though rather vocal about his opinions of my operation here." A thin smile. "Ranger Collins, unfortunately, experienced an accident during his inspection of the storm damage. Very tragic." The implication was clear, sending a chill through Ethan despite the stuffiness of the bunker. "You killed him." "I wasn't even present," Whitaker corrected smoothly. "But these mountains can be treacherous after a storm. Landslides, unstable terrain. The ranger was working alone in a dangerous area. Accidents happen." Ethan's mind raced, trying to piece together how he had ended up here. The last thing he remembered was falling on the slope, Bandit appearing with his family group, the sound of Whitaker's men searching. "You're wondering how we found you," Whitaker observed, reading his expression. "Your raccoon friend led us right to you." "Not intentionally, of course, but my men have been tracking that particular specimen for years. When several of our tracking collars converged on one location, we knew something significant was happening." He leaned forward slightly. "Imagine our surprise when we discovered not only the elusive one-eared alpha, but also the doctor who's been interfering with our operation." "Your illegal operation," Ethan corrected, anger momentarily overriding his fear. "Experimenting on protected wildlife, unauthorized medical research, environmental violations. How many federal laws are you breaking, Judge?" Whitaker sighed, as if disappointed by Ethan's lack of understanding. "Progress often requires operating in gray areas, Doctor. The pharmaceutical industry spends billions on research and development, jumping through regulatory hoops that delay life-saving treatments from reaching the market. Meanwhile, these raccoons, these seemingly ordinary animals, harbor genetic traits that could revolutionize treatments for toxin exposure, viral infections, even certain cancers. So you torture and kill them for profit," Ethan said flatly. "I utilize a natural resource for the greater good," Whitaker countered. "The enzymes we've isolated from their liver tissue have already shown remarkable efficacy in neutralizing bacterial toxins. The patents alone are worth hundreds of millions, potentially billions over time." Ethan glanced around the facility, noticing for the first time that much of the equipment was being packed into crates. "You're shutting down." "Relocating," Whitaker corrected. "The storm damage exposed this facility sooner than anticipated. Fortunately, we've collected sufficient specimens and data to continue our work elsewhere." He stood, straightening his jacket with the casual dignity of a man accustomed to authority. "Which brings us to the question of what to do with you and Earl. Despite his precarious situation, Ethan felt a surge of desperate hope. If Whitaker was talking rather than simply eliminating them, it meant he was concerned about something, perhaps exposure or loose ends that couldn't be easily tied up. "Becky knows I came up here," Ethan said, gambling on Whitaker's caution. "If I don't return, she'll go straight to the authorities." "Your wife is currently at Martha Reynolds' home with your children, unaware of your predicament," Whitaker replied smoothly. "By the time she becomes concerned enough to contact authorities, this facility will be completely cleared, and you and Earl will be—" He paused, selecting his words carefully. "Victims of the storm's aftermath. 2 men caught in a landslide while assessing damage. A tragic loss for the community." The calculated coldness of the statement confirmed what Ethan had feared. Whitaker had no intention of letting them leave alive. Their deaths would be staged as an accident, their bodies perhaps never recovered from the unstable terrain of the ridge. "The authorities already know about this place," Ethan tried, desperation mounting. "Ranger Collins called it in before your men found him. Federal agents will be here any minute." A flicker of uncertainty crossed Whitaker's face, quickly masked. "A bluff, Doctor. Collins had no opportunity to contact anyone. His vehicle was still at the access point, his radio intact in his pocket." Relief washed through Ethan, though he was careful not to show it. Collins had indeed called it in. Whitaker's confirmation that the radio was still on Collins' body proved he hadn't checked whether a call had been made. "Now, I have preparations to oversee," Whitaker continued, checking his watch. "My associate will ensure you're comfortable until arrangements for your departure can be finalized." As Whitaker turned to leave, Ethan made one last, desperate attempt. "The Raccoons. What happened to Bandit and the others that were with me?" The judge paused, a smile touching his lips that didn't reach his eyes. "The one-eared Alpha and several others were successfully contained. They're being transported to our new facility as we speak. Particularly valuable specimens, especially the Alpha. Its genetic markers are the most promising we've seen." The thought of Bandit in a cage, destined for the same fate as the others Ethan had seen dissected on the steel tables, sent a wave of nausea through him. After everything, the rescue, the bond they'd formed, Bandit's inexplicable return to help him, it couldn't end like this. "They're not just test subjects," Ethan said, his voice cracking with emotion and dehydration. "They're intelligent beings. They feel pain, form social bonds, solve complex problems. What you're doing isn't just illegal, it's wrong." Whitaker regarded him with something like pity. "Sentiment is a luxury, Doctor, one I cannot afford." He turned to the security man. 2 hours, no more. Make it look natural. Exposure, injuries from the fall, nothing that would raise questions." With that, he left, the heavy door closing behind him with a definitive thud, leaving Ethan alone with the stone-faced security operative. "You don't have to do this," Ethan said, addressing the man directly. "Whatever he's paying you, it's not worth a murder charge when this all comes out." The man, mid-40s, military haircut, the disciplined physique of someone accustomed to violence, regarded Ethan impassively. "Save your breath, Doctor. This isn't my first cleanup operation." The casual reference to prior killings silenced Ethan more effectively than any threat. This was a professional, someone for whom eliminating witnesses was simply part of the job description. Appeals to conscience or fear of consequences wouldn't work. Instead, Ethan focused on assessing his situation. His leg was crudely splinted with what appeared to be pieces of a first aid kit, limiting his mobility severely. The bunker had no windows, only the single metal door through which Whitaker had exited. The security man was armed and clearly experienced. The odds of escape or rescue seemed vanishingly small. Yet something nagged at Ethan's memory, a detail from his hazy recollection of being found on the hillside. Bandit hadn't been alone. He'd brought his entire family group. Why would a wild animal do that unless— A sound from outside the bunker interrupted his thoughts, a sharp, metallic clang followed by raised voices. The security man tensed, hand moving to his holstered weapon as he listened intently. "Stay put," he ordered unnecessarily, moving toward the door. "Make a sound, and I'll shoot you where you sit." As the man eased the door open and slipped outside, Ethan's mind raced. This might be his only chance. He looked around desperately for anything that could serve as a weapon or tool. The room had been largely cleared, but on one of the steel tables lay a tray of surgical instruments overlooked in the hasty packing. Ignoring the searing pain in his leg, Ethan dragged himself across the concrete floor toward the table. Each movement was agony, the broken bones grinding despite the splint, but fear and adrenaline pushed him forward. Outside, the voices grew louder, more agitated. Something was happening, a confrontation of some kind. Reaching the table, Ethan pulled himself upright enough to see the instruments: scalpels, forceps, scissors. He grabbed a scalpel, its blade wickedly sharp, designed for precision cutting of flesh. Not much of a weapon against a gun, but better than nothing. The door burst open, and Ethan brandished the scalpel, ready to fight despite the futility, but instead of the security man, Earl Thompson stumbled through, his face bruised, hands bound before him with plastic zip ties. "Earl!" Ethan exclaimed, relief flooding through him. "No time," Earl gasped, awkwardly maneuvering with his bound hands to help Ethan up. "Something's happening outside. Everyone's scrambling. This is our chance." "How did you get free?" "Wasn't me," Earl said, his expression a mix of disbelief and wonder. "It was your damn raccoon." "Bandit? But Whitaker said they captured him." "They thought they did. Caught several of his group, but not the one-eared alpha. He's been causing chaos out there, triggering traps, releasing the caught raccoons, leading Whitaker's men on wild chases through the woods." Earl shook his head in amazement. "Never seen anything like it." "It's like he's deliberately creating distractions." Hope surged in Ethan's chest. "He's creating a diversion. For us." Sounds crazy, I know. But after everything we've seen. Earl trailed off as shouts and the sound of vehicles revving their engines came from outside. "They're moving out, abandoning the facility ahead of schedule. We need to go, now." Ethan used the scalpel to cut through Earl's zip ties, then fashioned a more secure splint for his leg using materials from a first aid kit Earl had grabbed during his escape. Together they made their way toward the exit, Ethan leaning heavily on Earl's shoulder, each step a fresh lesson in pain. Outside, twilight was falling, the forest descending into shadow. The clearing in front of the bunker was a scene of chaotic activity, men loading equipment into vehicles, Whitaker himself gesturing angrily as a cage was secured in the back of a van. Inside the cage, Ethan could make out the forms of several raccoons, their distinctive masked faces pressed against the bars. "Bandit's family," he murmured, recognizing some of the raccoons that had gathered around him on the hillside. "They've captured them after all." "Not all," Earl said quietly, nodding toward the tree line. There, just visible in the gathering darkness, stood a familiar figure, a raccoon with a distinctive profile showing a missing left ear. Bandit was watching the activity from a safe distance, his posture alert but not fearful. "He's still free," Ethan breathed, "but for how long they won't stop hunting him." "One problem at a time," Earl replied grimly. "First, we need to get out of here without being seen." They retreated into the shadows of the bunker entrance, watching for an opportunity to move. The security man who had been guarding Ethan was now helping load the last of the equipment, his back to them. Whitaker stood by his SUV, speaking urgently into a satellite phone, gesturing with his free hand in evident frustration. "They're in a hurry," Earl observed. "Something's spooked them beyond just our discovery of this place." A distant sound provided the answer, the distinctive thrum of helicopter rotors approaching from the south. Whitaker's head snapped up at the sound, his expression hardening. Federal agents, Ethan realized. Collins must have gotten a call out before they found him. Whitaker barked orders, and the tempo of the evacuation accelerated. Men abandoned less essential equipment, focusing on loading the cages and what appeared to be refrigerated containers, likely containing tissue samples and research materials. "This is our chance," Earl said, eyeing the chaos. "While they're distracted by the helicopter, there's a maintenance access at the back of the bunker, leads to a utility corridor that comes out near the old fire road. If we can get there before they seal everything up." The decision was made for them as the security man suddenly turned, his gaze sweeping the bunker entrance where they hid. For a heartbeat, their eyes met, and Ethan saw the man's hand move toward his weapon. Before he could draw, however, a blur of motion erupted from the nearby underbrush. Bandit, moving with startling speed, launched himself at the security man, landing on his back and clawing frantically. The man yelled in surprise and pain, his hand diverted from his gun as he tried to dislodge the furious raccoon. "Now!" Earl urged, half dragging Ethan toward the back of the bunker as the commotion drew the attention of the other men. They had covered perhaps half the distance when Ethan heard a gunshot, followed by a pained animal cry that turned his blood to ice. He twisted, looking back despite Earl's attempts to keep him moving. The security man stood with his gun drawn, a satisfied expression on his face. At his feet lay a motionless form, a raccoon, blood matting its fur. "Bandit!" Ethan cried, forgetting caution, forgetting his own safety. He tried to turn back, but Earl's grip was iron. "It's too late," Earl said grimly, continuing to pull him toward the escape route. "He bought us time. Don't waste it." Rage and grief warred within Ethan as he allowed Earl to guide him into the utility corridor, a narrow concrete passageway lined with pipes and electrical conduits dimly lit by emergency lighting. The sound of the helicopter was louder now, accompanied by shouted orders as Whitaker's men abandoned the remaining equipment and fled. "How could they do that?" Ethan demanded, his voice breaking. "He was just an animal to them, something to be used and discarded." "Not to you," Earl replied quietly, "and not to me, not anymore. But we need to keep moving. Those federal agents won't know friend from foe if they find us here." They continued through the corridor, the sounds of the evacuation fading behind them. Ethan moved mechanically, his mind still fixed on the image of Bandit falling, on the casual cruelty of a man who could shoot a wild creature without hesitation. After what seemed like an eternity of painful progress, they reached the end of the corridor, a metal door that opened onto a hillside obscured by dense undergrowth. The helicopter was directly overhead now, its searchlight sweeping the clearing by the bunker's main entrance. "We need to get clear before they start a ground search," Earl said, helping Ethan through the door. "There's an old hunter's cabin about a mile from here. We can hole up there, try to make contact with the authorities once we're sure it's safe." Ethan nodded numbly, too exhausted and grief-stricken to argue. The knowledge that Bandit had sacrificed himself to create a diversion, that the intelligent, loyal creature was gone because of Ethan's involvement in discovering Whitaker's operation, was a weight that threatened to crush him more effectively than any physical injury. They had covered perhaps half the distance to the cabin when the distinctive crack of gunfire erupted behind them. Not a single shot this time, but a sustained exchange. The federal agents had engaged with someone, perhaps Whitaker's security team covering their retreat. "Keep moving," Earl urged as Ethan hesitated. "Nothing we can do to help them." But Ethan's attention had been caught by something else, a rustling in the underbrush ahead, too deliberate to be the wind. He tensed, fearing one of Whitaker's men had circled around to cut off their escape. Instead, a familiar figure emerged from the shadows, a raccoon moving with a slight limp, its left ear conspicuously missing. "Bandit?" Ethan breathed, disbelieving. "But I saw—" The raccoon chittered softly, approaching with cautious familiarity. In the dim light, Ethan could see that while the animal was indeed injured, a graze along its flank that matted the fur with blood, it was very much alive. "I'll be damned," Earl whispered. "Must have been another raccoon that got shot. This one's too smart to get caught like that." Relief washed through Ethan, so intense it momentarily eclipsed the pain of his broken leg. "He found us again. And he's trying to tell us something," Earl observed as Bandit circled impatiently, moving a few steps deeper into the forest before looking back at them expectantly. "I think he wants us to follow him." "Can we trust him?" Ethan asked, the question seeming absurd even as he voiced it. After everything Bandit had done, the initial bond they'd formed, his return to help with the injured juvenile, his apparent efforts to create diversions during their escape, how could they not trust him? Earl's weathered face creased in a tired smile. "At this point, Doc, I trust that raccoon a hell of a lot more than most humans I know." With the sounds of conflict echoing behind them and darkness settling over the forest, they followed Bandit deeper into the wilderness, away from the bunker, away from Whitaker's operation, toward an uncertain destination that somehow, against all logic, felt like their best hope for survival. The one-eared raccoon led them with purpose, occasionally doubling back to ensure they were still following, choosing paths that accommodated Ethan's limited mobility. It was behavior so far beyond normal animal instinct that Ethan found himself questioning everything he thought he knew about the boundaries between human and animal intelligence. "What Becky's been researching," he said as they paused for him to rest his injured leg, "about raccoon intelligence and social structures, she was right. They're capable of more than we ever imagined." Earl nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Makes you wonder what else we've missed about the creatures we share this world with. What other intelligence we've overlooked because it doesn't look like our own." As night fully enveloped the forest, Bandit led them to a hollow beneath a massive fallen oak, its root system creating a natural shelter. Inside, to Ethan's astonishment, waited several other raccoons, members of Bandit's family group who had evaded capture. They've created a safe haven, Ethan realized, watching as the raccoons settled around them, their presence somehow comforting in the darkness. "And they've brought us here to protect us." Earl leaned back against the earthen wall of the hollow, exhaustion evident in every line of his body. "Roles reversed, isn't it? First, you saved him, now he's saving you." As Bandit settled beside Ethan, his warm body a comforting presence against the chill of the night, Ethan found himself reflecting on the strange journey that had brought them to this moment. From that first encounter with an injured Kit to this night of danger and revelation, their lives had become intertwined in ways he could never have imagined. Whatever happened next, whether they successfully exposed Whitaker's operation, whether they could protect the remaining raccoons, whether Ethan could return to his family and the life he'd built in Oak Ridge Valley, one truth had become undeniable. The boundary between human and animal, between civilization and wilderness, was far more permeable than he had ever believed. And in that realization lay both profound responsibility and unexpected hope. Dawn broke over the mountains with tentative fingers of light, illuminating the hollow where Ethan, Earl, and their unlikely guardians had spent the night. Ethan awoke to find Bandit still beside him, the raccoon's intelligent eyes watchful in the growing light. The pain in Ethan's leg had settled into a persistent throb, manageable but concerning. He knew without proper medical attention, infection would become a serious risk. "Morning," Earl greeted softly, already awake and sitting at the entrance to their shelter. "Heard helicopters passing overhead a couple times during the night. Search patterns, most likely." "Looking for us or for Whitaker?" Ethan asked, carefully shifting to a more upright position. "Both, I reckon." Earl offered Ethan a canteen of water he'd managed to keep during their escape. That leg needs proper medical attention. We can't stay out here much longer. Ethan nodded, taking a grateful sip. We need to contact Becky. Let her know we're alive. And we need to make sure those federal agents understand what they've found, the full scope of Whitaker's operation. First things first, Earl said, eyeing Ethan's splinted leg. Let's get you somewhere safe, then worry about the rest. As if understanding their conversation, Bandit moved to the entrance of the hollow, chittering softly to the other raccoons. One by one they disappeared into the forest, their movements purposeful rather than panicked. Scouts, Earl observed, checking if it's safe out there. Ethan watched in fascination. Their social organization is remarkable. Becky was documenting behaviors like this in her research: task specialization, cooperative problem-solving, sentinel duties, but seeing it firsthand changes your perspective, Earl finished for him. Makes you question what we think we know about these creatures. Within 20 minutes, the raccoons began returning, converging on Bandit with what appeared to be a complex series of vocalizations and physical interactions. The one-eared leader processed this information, then returned to Ethan's side with clear intent. I think he wants us to follow again, Ethan said, bracing himself for the pain of movement. Earl helped Ethan to his feet, supporting him as they emerged from the hollow into the crisp morning air. The forest was quiet, except for birdsong and the rustling of leaves in the gentle breeze. No sounds of helicopter rotors or search teams. Bandit led them along game trails that meandered downhill, choosing paths gentle enough for Ethan to navigate despite his injury. The other raccoons moved alongside and ahead, occasionally disappearing only to return minutes later, as if confirming the route remained safe. They're taking us down toward Highway 27, Earl realized after nearly an hour of slow progress. That's the main road that runs along the valley floor. Civilization, Ethan said with relief. But how would Bandit know that's where we need to go? Earl shrugged. Same way he knew to find us on that hillside, I suppose. Same way he knew to create distractions during the evacuation. Some things defy explanation, Doc. They continued their careful descent, pausing frequently for Ethan to rest his injured leg. The forest gradually thinned, giving way to second-growth woodland, and eventually the scrubby underbrush that bordered rural properties. Through a gap in the trees, Ethan caught sight of a familiar landscape: Martha Reynolds's farmhouse, its white clapboard siding gleaming in the morning sun. The very place where Becky and the children had taken shelter. Martha's place, he breathed, hope surging through him. How did Bandit know? Maybe he didn't, Earl suggested, though he looked equally amazed. Maybe it's just the closest safe place on this side of the ridge. Bandit had stopped at the edge of the tree line, his posture alert as he surveyed the open ground between the forest and the farmhouse. After a moment's consideration, he turned to Ethan and chittered softly, then retreated a few steps into the protective cover of the trees. He's not coming with us, Ethan realized with a pang of sadness. He knows it's not safe for him out in the open. Smart, Earl agreed. Whitaker may be on the run, but his men could still be looking for that one-eared raccoon. Better for Bandit to stay hidden for now. Ethan knelt painfully, bringing himself to eye level with the raccoon who had saved his life multiple times over. Thank you, he said simply, knowing the words were inadequate, but feeling the need to say them anyway. For everything. Bandit regarded him with those intelligent eyes, then did something that left both men speechless. He raised a paw and placed it briefly on Ethan's hand, a gesture so deliberate and uncharacteristic of wild animal behavior that it defied explanation. Then, with a final soft vocalization, Bandit turned and melted into the forest, the other raccoons following until they had all disappeared from sight. I've spent 78 years in these mountains, Earl said quietly, and I've never seen anything like that animal. Ethan nodded, emotion tightening his throat as he watched the spot where Bandit had vanished. I don't think anyone has. With Earl's support, Ethan made his way across the open field toward Martha's farmhouse. They had covered perhaps half the distance when the front door flew open and a figure burst out. Becky, her face transforming from worry to disbelieving joy as she recognized them. "Ethan!" she cried, running toward them with Grace and Noah following close behind, Martha's stooped figure watching from the porch. "Oh my God, you're alive!" The reunion was a blur of tears and embraces, with Grace clinging to his neck and Noah babbling excitedly, too young to understand the significance of his father's return, but catching the emotional current from the adults around him. "Your leg!" Becky gasped, her nurse's training immediately assessing the crude splint. "What happened? We heard there was a shootout on the ridge, that federal agents found some kind of illegal operation. The local news is saying Judge Whitaker is wanted for questioning but has disappeared." "It's a long story," Ethan said, overwhelmed by the simple miracle of holding his family again. "But first, I need to sit down before I fall down." Inside Martha's farmhouse, with his leg properly examined and re-splinted by Becky's expert hands, Ethan and Earl recounted everything: the discovery of the bunker, the true nature of Whitaker's operation, Collins's murder, their capture and escape, and most incredibly, Bandit's role in saving them. "I knew there was something special about him," Becky said, her scientific mind racing to process the implications of their story. "But this goes beyond anything documented in raccoon behavior. The recognition across years, the apparent planning, the coordination with his family group to create diversions and lead you to safety. It's extraordinary." "It's a miracle is what it is," Martha declared, setting a plate of biscuits on the table before them. "The good Lord works in mysterious ways, sometimes through the most unexpected vessels. Raccoon saved Daddy," Grace summarized with a child's straightforward clarity, proud of her understanding of the situation. "Daddy saved Raccoon first." "That's right, sweetheart," Ethan agreed, pulling her close with his free arm. "That's exactly what happened." The peaceful moment was interrupted by the sound of vehicles approaching outside. Everyone tensed, but Earl, who had positioned himself by the window, relaxed as he recognized the lead vehicle. "It's Ranger Collins's department truck," he reported, "and behind it, 2 black SUVs, federal agents most likely." Minutes later, they were greeting a very much alive Ranger Mike Collins, whose grim expression softened at the sight of them. "Thought you two might be dead," he said without preamble. "When we found blood at the bunker entrance but no bodies, we weren't sure what to think." "How are you alive?" Ethan asked in amazement. "Whitaker told us his men had killed you." Collins's mouth tightened. "They tried. Shot me in the shoulder when I confronted them, left me for dead in a ravine. If a search and rescue volunteer hadn't spotted me—" He shook his head, dismissing the close call. "What matters is we've uncovered the full operation. The FBI is coordinating with the Drug Enforcement Administration and the Fish and Wildlife Service. It's bigger than we thought. Not just illegal wildlife trafficking and unauthorized research, but potential bioweapon development." "Bioweapons?" Earl repeated incredulously. "The compounds they were extracting from the raccoons," Collins explained. "They have dual-use potential. Medicinal applications, yes, but also possible weaponization. That's why the feds moved so quickly once I got my call out." A tall woman in a crisp FBI windbreaker stepped forward, introducing herself as Special Agent Diana Mercer. "Dr. Calloway, Mr. Thompson, we need your full statements as soon as possible. You're key witnesses in what's shaping up to be one of the largest biotech smuggling cases in recent history." "Judge Whitaker?" Ethan asked. "In the wind, for now," Agent Mercer admitted. "But we've frozen his assets, issued warrants, and alerted international authorities. Several of his associates were apprehended during last night's operation, including his head of security, who's already looking for a deal." "And the raccoons they captured?" Ethan couldn't help asking. "The ones in the cages?" Collins and Mercer exchanged glances. "Some were recovered when we intercepted one of their transport vehicles," Collins said. They're being evaluated by wildlife specialists before release. Others, he hesitated, were transported out before we could intercept, Mercer finished. We're still tracking those shipments. The thought of Bandit's family members being subjected to Whitaker's experiments turned Ethan's stomach. There's one particular raccoon we need to protect, he said, explaining about Bandit. His unusual intelligence, his missing ear, his apparent status as the primary target of Whitaker's operation. The alpha with the genetic markers they were most interested in. Mercer nodded, making notes. If he's still free, we should try to locate and protect him. He's both a valuable witness in a sense and potentially still in danger if any of Whitaker's associates remain in the area. He's close, Ethan said, glancing toward the forest visible through Martha's windows. Watching, waiting to see if it's safe. I'd like to meet this remarkable animal, Mercer said, her professional demeanor softening slightly. And I'd like to discuss your wife's research in detail, Mrs. Calloway. It may be crucial to understanding what Whitaker was after and why. The next few hours were a whirlwind of activity, statements taken, evidence cataloged, Ethan's leg properly treated by paramedics who strongly recommended hospital evaluation. Through it all, Ethan found his gaze repeatedly drawn to the edge of the forest, wondering if Bandit was still out there, watching and waiting. As evening approached and the officials finally began to disperse, promising round-the-clock protection until Whitaker was apprehended, Ethan made a decision. Declining the ambulance transport to the hospital for one more night, he asked Earl and Becky to help him out onto Martha's back porch, which faced the forest. "What are you doing?" Becky asked as they settled him in a rocking chair, his splinted leg propped on a footstool. "Waiting," Ethan replied simply. "He found me twice before. I want to give him the chance to find me again, to know that it's safe now." Becky squeezed his shoulder, understanding. "I'll bring you some coffee. It's getting cool out here." As darkness fell and the stars appeared one by one above the ancient mountains, Ethan sat alone on the porch, watching the tree line. The events of the past days seemed almost dreamlike in retrospect. The discovery of the bunker, the confrontation with Whitaker, the desperate escape, and throughout it all, the inexplicable behavior of a wild raccoon who had somehow remembered a human kindness from years before. A slight movement at the forest edge caught his attention. Ethan leaned forward, straining to see in the gathering darkness. For a moment, nothing. Then, a familiar shape emerged cautiously from the underbrush. Bandit, his distinctive profile unmistakable even in the dim light. "Hello, old friend," Ethan called softly. The raccoon hesitated, then began moving toward the house with deliberate steps. Behind him, more shapes appeared, the rest of his family group following their leader's example. Becky appeared in the doorway, drawn by Ethan's voice. "Oh my God," she breathed, seeing the procession of raccoons approaching. "Grace? Noah, come quickly but quietly. Look who's here." The children's faces appeared, eyes wide with wonder as they watched the raccoons cross the yard. Grace, remembering Bandit from years before, whispered his name with reverence. Bandit stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, looking up at the assembled humans with those intelligent eyes that seemed to hold so much more than animal instinct. After a moment's consideration, he ascended the steps with delicate precision, the other raccoons remaining at a cautious distance. At the top of the steps, Bandit paused, then approached Ethan directly. Without hesitation, he placed a paw on Ethan's knee, the same gesture of connection he had made years ago when they first bonded and again in the forest when they parted. "I think he's saying, 'Thank you,'" Grace whispered, her small hand finding Ethan's. "No," Ethan corrected gently, emotion thick in his voice. "I think he's saying we're family now." As if confirming this interpretation, Bandit made a soft chattering sound, then turned to acknowledge each person on the porch in turn. Becky, Grace, Noah, and finally Earl, who had joined them silently. "What happens now?" Becky asked, watching the extraordinary scene unfold. Ethan considered the question, understanding its complexity. Bandit was still a wild animal, still the leader of his family group. Yet he had demonstrated a connection to humans, to this human family specifically, that transcended ordinary animal behavior. "Now we protect him and he protects us," Ethan said simply. "We find a way to coexist." In the days and weeks that followed, that's exactly what they did. As Ethan recovered from his injuries, as the federal investigation into Whitaker's operation expanded to include international pharmaceutical companies and government officials, as Oak Ridge Valley grappled with the shocking revelation that their respected judge had been operating a criminal enterprise in their midst, the Calloway family and Bandit's Raccoon family established a new kind of relationship. The university, impressed by the importance of Becky's research in uncovering the illegal operation, fast-tracked the development of the wildlife sanctuary she had proposed. The 10 acres expanded to 50, then 100, a protected area where Bandit and his family could live safely while still being studied and occasionally visited by the humans who had become part of their extended family. Judge Whitaker was eventually apprehended trying to cross the Canadian border, his empire crumbling as associates turned on each other in exchange for leniency. The full scope of his operation proved even more extensive than initially suspected, with connections to black market wildlife trafficking rings across 3 continents. The raccoons recovered from Whitaker's transport vehicles were rehabilitated and released into Becky's sanctuary, reuniting with their family groups. The genetic research continued, but now under ethical oversight, with the goal of understanding these remarkable animals rather than exploiting them. Ethan returned to his medical practice with a new perspective, incorporating more traditional healing methods learned from the elders of Oak Ridge Valley, including Martha Reynolds, whose wisdom had proven invaluable throughout their ordeal. The clinic expanded, adding a wildlife treatment center where injured animals could receive care before being released back into the forest. Earl Thompson, at 80, found a new purpose as the sanctuary's first ranger, his intimate knowledge of the forest and its inhabitants making him the perfect guardian for the land and the creatures who called it home. Grace grew from a curious child into a thoughtful young girl who spent hours observing the raccoons, recording their behaviors in notebooks that grew increasingly sophisticated as her understanding deepened. Noah toddled after her, learning from his earliest years that the boundary between human and animal was not as fixed or impermeable as most believed. And Bandit, the one-eared raccoon who had started it all, continued to defy conventional understanding of animal behavior. Though he maintained his wild nature, leading his family group with the same intelligence and adaptability that had saved Ethan's life, he also chose to maintain his connection with the humans who had become part of his story. On summer evenings, the Calloway family would often sit on their porch, watching as Bandit and his group emerged from the forest at twilight. Sometimes he would approach, accepting an offered treat or simply sitting quietly nearby, his presence a reminder of the remarkable bond they had formed. "You know," Becky said on one such evening, watching as Grace carefully sketched Bandit's profile in her notebook, "conventional science still can't explain him. The level of recognition, the apparent reciprocity, the social complexity he exhibits, it goes beyond what we thought raccoons were capable of." "Maybe that's the point," Ethan replied, the memories of those desperate days on the ridge still vivid despite the passing of time. "Maybe we've been underestimating them, and a lot of other creatures all along." Martha Reynolds, who had joined them for dinner, nodded her agreement. "My grandmother used to say that animals know more than they let on, and humans know less than they think they do. Seems to me she was right on both counts." As if understanding the conversation, Bandit looked up, his intelligent eyes meeting Ethan's across the yard. In that gaze was a connection that transcended species, that spoke to something more fundamental, a recognition of kindred spirits who had saved each other, who had forged a bond in the crucible of danger and trust. Some in the scientific community remained skeptical of Becky's research and the Callaway's claims about Bandit's extraordinary behavior. Some in Oak Ridge Valley whispered that the trauma of their experience had led them to anthropomorphize a wild animal, to see intelligence where there was only instinct. But for the Callaway family, and for those who had witnessed the events firsthand, the truth was self-evident. In saving a small, injured raccoon with a torn ear, Ethan had set in motion a chain of events that would not only transform his life, but challenge humanity's understanding of the creatures with whom we share this world. And in the end, perhaps that was Bandit's greatest gift. Not just the life he had saved, but the perspective he had changed, the boundaries he had blurred, and the reminder that compassion extended even to the smallest and most overlooked beings can return to us in ways we could never anticipate. As twilight deepened into night and Bandit led his family back into the protective embrace of the forest, Ethan felt a profound sense of peace. The journey that had begun with an act of kindness toward an injured animal had come full circle, leaving everyone involved, human and raccoon alike, forever changed. And in that change lay hope, not just for Bandit and his kind, but for a world where the connections between all living things might finally be recognized, respected, and preserved. "Good night, old friend," Ethan called softly as the last raccoon disappeared into the shadows. "Until tomorrow. When life seems to be winding down, it's often just preparing us for our most meaningful chapter." Ethan Callaway's unexpected bond with a one-eared raccoon reminds us that compassion never goes unrewarded, even when years have passed. In our golden years, we may feel overlooked or undervalued. But like Bandit, who remembered a simple act of kindness through the seasons, the seeds we've planted throughout our lives bear fruit in ways we never imagined. The connection between this wild creature and the family who saved him transcends conventional understanding, just as our own legacies extend beyond what we can see. As we navigate our senior years, perhaps our greatest gift is recognizing that we're still creating our story, still capable of forming profound connections, still changing lives with small acts of kindness. Has an unexpected relationship or chance encounter ever changed the course of your life? Or have you ever performed a small act of kindness that returned to you years later in ways you never anticipated? Please share your stories in the comments below. Your experiences may be the very inspiration someone else needs today.